We're delighted once again to be in London and very excited to have Warren Mosler with us. It seems a very long time ago since our event in Birmingham, when still in the first flush of enthusiasm for our task. So much has happened in between, which has rather scuppered our plans, but we are nevertheless very pleased to be here and still eager to deliver the educational aims we set for ourselves as an organisation. Warren, as you will know, is one of the contributors to our recently published book, Modern Monetary Theory, Key Insights Leading Thinkers. So we are looking forward to his presentation of his chapter, as well as a discussion on framing the job guarantee and trade and real wealth, which will provide much food for thought and no doubt present many questions. It seems that it always sends us small hiccups to deal with, and on hearing that a rail strike had been announced, whilst clearly standing in solidarity with striking workers, there was some initial panic, on my part at least. Would we have to cancel? And if not, how many people would still be able to get here? Or would Warren be presenting to an empty room? As it turns out, we needn't have worried, and we're delighted that so many of you have been able to get here one way or another. It doesn't seem possible that in just under a couple of months it will be GIMMS' 5th birthday. Whilst prior to its formation, the first stirrings of a UK MNT movement were already underway. It was a meeting at the Gower Room at UCL that really decided that we must do something more concrete. And from small seeds, in time, as trees grow, not quite there yet, but today we have, along with our colleagues at the MNT podcast, played an important role in raising greater awareness of monetary reality. Our book was an unexpected icing on the cake, and we are very proud of what we have managed to achieve and grateful to all those who have given us encouragement and support. But there is much more to do. We are without doubt living in uncertain, unstable times that will possibly mark the beginnings of a global revolution in terms of the structures of power and wealth which currently dominate. Who can predict what comes next? A pandemic and a war are changing the rules of engagement as the global south begins to find its voice and seeks to break the shackles that have hitherto kept it impoverished, exploited, and in service to the needs of the West. As Lula, the president of Brazil, noted in a recent speech at the Amazon summit, the top 10% of the world's population holds over 75% of the wealth and emits nearly half of all the carbon released into the atmosphere. One cannot, he said, discuss tropical forests and climate change without addressing the historical responsibility of developed countries, which have been the biggest squanderers of natural resources and the largest contributor to planetary pollution. A global economic system run by the few through institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank, along with national and supranational governments captured by an economic ideology, has wrought huge damage in terms of people's lives, growing poverty and rising inequality, decaying public infrastructure, and the growing threat that is posed by climate change and ecological overshoot. This is therefore a moment for a radical rethink about how we live our lives and the role that government plays in achieving that. We can no longer talk solely about domestic concerns without understanding the geopolitical context of our existence and the interdependencies which are being exposed. A viable future for us all will rely on cooperation and collaboration on the key challenges of our time, along with respectful treatment of our neighbours and fair trading arrangements between nations. As the central bank takes the media limelight and the flag in terms of the winners and losers of monetary policy, we need to bring greater clarity and greater understanding of the power of government to effect change through policy and spending priorities. Those are the real measures of a government's economic record, what it did and who benefited. We have witnessed with our own eyes the beneficiaries of government spending, and we need to challenge the monetary mechanism, aka household budget accounting, that is used to skew the distribution of wealth, pouring it into the hands of the few and leaving the rest to scrabble for the crumbs or sink under the burden of lack of adequate support. After a period of vast government spending to support people through the pandemic and the global supply issues resulting from the war in Ukraine, we seem to be tracing our steps backwards, with the same old spending narratives being hammered out like they were going out of fashion by politicians of all stripes, government institutions, think tanks on both the left and the right, and academia, all aided by a media with a few exceptions, which reinforces daily those false narratives. After the vast sums of money spent to support the economy, now comes the austerity again, as political parties, instead of fighting to serve the nation and its citizens, fight for the dubious title of being the most fiscally responsible. At one end of the scale, poverty and inequality is being reinforced through government policy, and at the other, action on existential crisis of climate change and ecological overshoot is to be postponed until some undefined time in the future, all dependent on growth and increased tax revenues. The leave it to the markets approach and all will be well. We are at a critical moment in history, and never has it been more important to increase our determination and target our efforts effectively to raise public awareness of how government really spends, show that the real constraints to that spending are resource-led, and that it isn't money in itself that determines what a government can do, but political will. As the established order aims yet again to shore up the neoliberal fortress, plugging the breaches yet again in favour of the status quo, the question for us all now is how we can more effectively challenge the prevailing narrative and reverse the tide of ignorance that is holding back the change we need. Small organisations like GIMMS and the MMT podcast do and can continue to play a role. However, the biggest obstacle that we face is a media that keeps the narratives alive and well in the public consciousness. It is therefore for us to explore every avenue that we can to bring MMT to an ever wider audience so that we can secure an environmentally sustainable economy and a fairer society for future generations. Thank you very much for listening. I'm going to pass you on to Phil, our first speaker. And just before I do, I need to sort of do a little bit of health and safety, so you all know where to go in case. In the event of the fire alarm going off, the exits are through the doors here and here, and you just need to follow the signs to the fire exits. Don't use the lifts, please. I'm sure that you all know not to do that. The loos you've probably found them already, and over to Phil. Thank you.
Well, first of all, just to say it's a great pleasure for me to be here and to be working with Prue and Sarah and Claire, of course, and of course what a day to be welcoming our founder, the MMT founder Warren, next to me, and his good lady wife Elizabeth is there in the audience to see him, so he'll have to be on his best behaviour today, I'm sure. I'm not really going to speak very much because I'm well known to like the sound of my own voice being a teacher, so today you're to see Warren. Just to say that Warren himself, he introduced me to MMT in about 2010. He's a fantastic communicator. You send him an email and you get an answer straight away, unlike academics who some of you may be, well, around more over 40, some of you probably sent a question 20 years ago to an academic and you're still waiting. So Warren is a great communicator. He answers everything fantastically. Without Warren, I wouldn't have any understanding of MMT. If you're new to MMT, get ready to be challenged when he starts. Get your brain going. Of course, if you know about MMT, Warren really doesn't need an introduction. One thing I will say, I'm currently engaged in trying to write Warren's biography. I think I'm going to divide it into 2 volumes. The first one is kind of about his early life, his sort of ability to act in lots of fields. The second one relies on me communicating with academics. Yeah, it's tough. And so it's quite slow getting a response. So that one might, going back to my earlier point, don't be rushing for that one. But I'm going to try and get something out reasonably quickly, because you want to find out a bit about how Warren sees the world. And I've got just 4 little quotes from the people I've interviewed from Warren's life. And firstly, he says Warren Mosler is an example of a rare type of person, a polymath. So he can operate in a lot of fields. He's obviously built his racing cars. Apparently, they just rattle up in a garage and embarrass Ferrari. He builds multi-hulled ferries that are still working out in the Caribbean. And of course, he invents his own school of economics, Mosler economics, which has now moved on to becoming MMT. Warren sees things other people don't see, so he looks at things and he can look deeper at what's causing what you see, but he doesn't always know how or why he can see it. He just sees it. The other thing, you ask him, like, how does he do it? And he goes, well, we don't realise what we need to know until we actually need to put that knowledge into effect. And basically, my final word is, he's a man in some ways of few words. People have said he can convey in a very small amount of words, some very deep truths. But fortunately, he's a man of many stories. And we're hoping, of course, to get a few of Warren's stories in a moment. So I'm going to be quiet now, and I just want you to give Warren a very warm welcome, as he's come a very long way.
Okay, I'm going to get closer so I don't have to speak quite as loud. And no one had a pencil, so I took some notes on my I heard, so why is everybody here about MMT? And I think it's because it opens up policy options that weren't considered viable before, that are attractive to a lot of people, such as sustaining full employment, where it's always been assumed that there's a trade-off, and if you have high levels of employment, you're going to get high levels of inflation. But once you understand monetary operations, you realize that full employment policies, such as a job guarantee, is how you get lower inflation. And so it just changes that whole dynamic. It changes the whole society. Once it's understood, the trick is to get other people to understand it. And the other thing that was said that I thought was found, I think I can remember, is, let the markets do it. Okay, the markets can take care of this. And what we understand is, when you understand monetary operations, you understand that currency itself is a monopoly. It's a public monopoly. And once you've got a monopoly at work, you don't have markets anymore. Markets are working in the context of that monopoly. And so all the mainstream theories assume competition, pure competition. If there is a monopoly that's doing, they point it out and show how it distorts markets and it's problematic, such as a labor union. Right? But they don't recognize the currency itself as a monopoly. And I've just been after them for 30-something years now. I've been doing this to just look at your mainstream models and add something to them. Start with an assumption that the currency itself is a monopoly. The government's puts taxation in place, coercive taxes, they don't even have that. And the tax credit, the thing you need to pay the tax, the currency, the money to pay the tax comes only from the government through its agents. Put that in your models and then everything will be fine. They have, and they won't do it. They've just fought that, they haven't done it. I've talked to a lot of people, Paul Krugman, Michael Woodford, top monetary economists, people at LSE, you name it. Who else have we talked to? Guys from Columbia, who's the Nobel Prize guy from Columbia? Stiglitz. Spent 2 days with that guy in catechized. Gets it, they just won't do it. And so anyway, this paper is about inflation. I'm a little bit hesitant because I see the questions and there aren't any questions about that. Now I'm here because you're all proponents in a way, and I'm here to, the way I see my role is to help give you the sound bites that you need to answer questions you get from other people to help get your ideas across. So I'll go through this relatively quickly. From the questions, it seems like I'm not quite answering your questions and helping you with this presentation, but I'll go through it. It's a program, unless you want me to skip to the question. Right. So number one, the purpose of this chapter is to prevent a framework for the analysis of. You'll see MMT, my papers are often titled, this is a framework for analysis. MMT is a framework for analysis. It's not a policy that you do. And the Republicans started a campaign saying the Democrats are doing MMT and they've ruined the country, vote for us. Of course, Democrats don't even know what MMT is, but that was a political ploy that they're doing it. And then the arguments get over, well, are they doing MMT or not? And you'll see these discussions about people doing or not doing MMT. It's a framework for analysis. You already know that. We are the only school of economic thought that specifically identifies and models both the source of the price level and how it changes. Mainstream economics, and there was an exchange on Twitter not too long ago, a couple of weeks ago, still discussing that after 50 years, the problem is they haven't identified the source of the price level. Because they don't know why prices are what they are, except that that's how they were yesterday. And because of something somebody did, they went up, or because something happened, they went down. But they don't know where this price level came from. They started this thing called the fiscal theory of the price level, which was interesting. And they dropped it because they couldn't get to the source of the price level. It's always, and so what they do in all their models is that they assume prices are at a certain level. And then they try to figure out what makes them change up or down. But they don't have a starting point. Right? And that's what, we have the starting point. The currency is a monopoly. Monopolists set a price. And I'll give you an example of that. Here, let's see. Markets, and mainstream knows this is a problem. This is that they can't get past. Markets can only set relative value. They will tell you how much is a chicken worth versus a turkey. 2 chickens is 1 turkey or something like that. They can tell you how things exchange for each other and what the ratio is. But if you get places where they don't have a currency, like you're in a monastery, or the American Indians before the Europeans came in, or Africa before the Europeans came in, they would exchange things, and things would exchange at certain values, kind of like a barter system. Okay, and it wasn't a huge amount, but there was exchange. They could never figure out how much a chicken cost in terms of yen. Okay, how are they going to do that? There is no yen. It's in Japan somewhere, or whatever. Or in terms of dollars or British pound. They had no way to put a numeraire on these things, that type of numeraire. All markets can do is come up with relative value. And all the mainstream economic models are relative value models. Arrow-Dubray's models and all these general equilibrium models are all relative value. And then they come in, and they say, now we're going to prices of this morning's price level at the open. This is what everything cost as of 9 a.m. this morning. And then they assign everything a price level. And then because of these dynamics in these relative value models, they'll show how prices might change. They don't know where that price comes from. So prices, in terms of currency, can only come from the outside. They can't be generated within a group of people. Okay, it has to come from the outside. A group of people can only determine relative value. If they want to start pricing everything in yen, they need an exchange rate. They need to know that somehow, what can a yen buy somewhere? It could be anything. We can say, 10 yen will buy a marble. Well, now we can figure everything out because they know what marbles are relative to everything else. Or 10 yen can buy a piece of 1 yard of concrete. Oh, okay, now we've got it. But they need some information from the outside to get started. Well, how about a Turkish lira? How do you price everything? Well, tell us something that a Turkish lira is worth, and then we can figure it out. But we can't do it unless you tell us that, or a British pound, or US dollar. They need external information. Okay? And that's what we've contributed. That's what this paper contributes right up at the beginning. That where does that information come from about how many dollars or how many pounds is worth something, so that the markets can then figure it all out? How much rent should be, how much wages should be, where does it start? Okay, and it starts, first the government, we start with the MMT money story. We got a nice little money story for you to start, and you want to use this for all your explanations. Number one, the government wants to, the whole purpose is for the government to provision itself. It wants labor, it wants jet planes, it wants public health, it wants all these things for itself. So it imposes a tax liability. It doesn't collect the tax first, it puts a tax liability in place. Without that, nothing happens. And for purposes of example, I assume a property tax, a tax on everybody's house, because you can understand that, you can keep track of it. If you say a tax on everybody's income, well, people don't work, they don't report it, and how do they know to get paid? It's complicated. It still works, but I have to spend 2 hours explaining how an income tax translates into this. A house tax, everybody can get it right away. So just start with that, and to give for the example. So we start with a property tax, and once the property tax is in place, whatever it is, 100 pounds a month per house or something, now you've got a population that needs those pounds, or they're going to lose their house. Some people are going to lose their house. Not everybody's a homeowner, but the homeowners are in trouble. They need those pounds out, and so they are willing to sell things to work to get pounds because they need the tax. And so the first thing is a tax liability, which creates people who need the money to pay the tax. People looking for paid work are called unemployed. So in the first instance, the tax is there to generate unemployment. The government can now pay those people to come to work, and now the market has an idea of what a pound is worth. The government is paying 30,000 pounds a year for somebody to be in the Army. Now it can get started, and from that, all the other prices can fall into place. In a perfect world with perfect markets, which we don't have. But without that, you have nothing. Okay. So what I say is the source of the price level are the prices government pays when it spends. And it would have to be what they call at the margin. Just because you paid something yesterday, if you pay something else today, the price you paid yesterday is old news. It's what you have to do to get that money on a continuous basis, to get those pounds on a continuous basis. All right, so we have the source of the price level. Right. And we know what makes it change ultimately. Now, there can be a lot of relative value changes. The peaches die, so the price of peaches go up, and there's a surplus of computer chips, so they go down. There's relative value changes, but we know that the price level is a function of prices paid by government. If the government starts paying more for the same thing, it's revaluing its currency downward. Right now, to get back to if you go to any central bank and you ask them what inflation is, they can't tell you that. They can tell you what this consumer price index did last month. It was up 0.2. Okay. They can tell you what their forecast is for next month. We think it'll be up 0.3. All right, but they can't tell you what the continuous change of prices is right now. Okay, that there is no such thing. And in fact, they can't even tell you what the price level is. They use an abstraction they call the consumer price index, which is the cost of living, which is something very different than the way academics defined inflation. And so not only do they not have a source of the price level, they don't have they don't know what it exactly is, and they'll tell you that. And so they come up with these abstractions to try and reflect the cost of living. And then somebody will come to me and say, well, how do we bring down inflation? And I'll say, well, it's a consumer price level. One way you could bring it down would be to eliminate the value-added tax, which is what, 25% or something? 20? That would drop all these prices 20%. Well, no, apart from that, how can we bring prices down? Well, and so it's like, well, what are we trying to do here? Why not just eliminate that and then, well, they can't give you an answer, So where are the prices coming from? In the United States, we had President Trump put a 17% tariff on lumber from Canada because they weren't charging us enough. Don't ever send that guy out shopping for you. But that's what people do. And the price of lumber went up 17%. President Biden comes in, decided that wasn't enough, that we need to punish Canada more, so we're going to, because they still weren't charging us enough, so he puts another 17% on, so now it's up 35%. Then they noticed the price of lumber's gone up 35% in housing, and now we have inflation. Well, what are we going to do about this inflation? Well, you just legislated the higher price. How about unlegislated? Well, we can't do that, but we have to raise the price through legislation, then bring it down by doing something else. Anyway, don't get started. Let's move on. If you can scroll up. We've already done the money story. Okay. The currency itself is a monopoly. This is a micro foundation. The fact whether there's a monopoly or not is something you learn in microeconomics. It's your first day of micro. They teach monopoly. It takes about 15 or 20 minutes. Then they move on to oligopoly. That might take the rest of the class. Then they go to competition, which takes the rest of your life. And you need asymptotes and math and all that. The good news is the currency is the easy one that took 15 minutes. It's a case of monopoly. The government has the tax credits, the pounds, that are used to pay taxes. We need them. It tells us what we have to do to get them. It defines the value of this currency that way. And now, what is it about a government that allows them to do this? They have taxing authority. They can punish people for not paying taxes. Anybody who has taxing authority can then tax, and then they tell you what the tax credit is, the thing you need to pay the tax. And that's it. Now, you can call that monetary sovereignty if you want, but then you're throwing, and I don't like doing that. And I don't know that I've ever done that, because you're throwing in another word for somebody to think of and try and remember the definition of. It just makes it harder. Okay? What we have is taxing authority, and then the thing to pay the tax. And that keeps it at a level where you can understand it. It's not something you have to keep coming back and what did that monetary sovereignty mean again? Okay? And governments who have taxing authority have policy options. They can put taxes in place, they can create employment, they can hire all the people they just caused to become unemployed, right? And so those are policy options. They can use up or take away their policy options with different policies. They can decide to fix the tax credit to gold. Well, now they've restricted themselves. they've eliminated certain policy options because now they have to have gold to give people for the money. Might be a good thing or a bad thing, and they can debate it. But to say that that takes away your monetary sovereignty, well, it doesn't take away your policy options. That's a policy option you employ. So I don't like to, this whole thing about degrees of sovereignty and degrees of being able to do it by engaging in policy options that restrict yourself. Again, it's second order, it complicates it. It's, I think it's counterproductive in trying to understand, to promote an understanding of what's going on. The other thing about, too many people I think lead off with taxes don't fund spending. Okay, and what they mean is the government's not revenue constrained. It spends first before taxes are paid. But what comes first are tax liabilities. And if you don't start with that, you can lose credibility. Once you tell people taxes don't fund spending, they think you don't need taxes, you're crazy, and they walk away. You're going to lose a lot of people right off the bat. Even though technically you're right, the word funding is ambiguous. So I don't use that kind of an ambiguous word because I find it counterproductive. But, you know, other people have found it productive, it's fine. I just find it problematic and much easier not to use it. All right, so, there's an exchange. Okay, so, a tax liability creates a need to pay taxes, but it creates a larger need in addition to that, and that's the need to save. People want to have more than enough just to pay their tax liability. And so, if the government tax liability would cause people to become unemployed, to seek paid work, and the government, when it pays them, will more often than not observe that it's going to pay out more than just is needed to pay the tax because there's a need to save, to have money in your pockets, to have a money supply, to have cash in the cash registers, to have reserves. You know, people lose them in the wash, parents take them home as souvenirs. There's reasons that people will accumulate more at the macro level than just what's needed. You certainly can't collect more than you spend because they're not there. So let's see. And here we can look at more closely what the where the value of the currency comes from and where the inflation comes from. Right, so if I used to use my old business card example. You guys want to hear that one more time? I don't have business cards anymore, but I have somebody else's. So if I take out my business card, what's this thing worth in this room? It's not worth anything. Okay, nobody's going to pay me any real money for this business card. And there's nobody looking for a job that pays in these business cards. But when I tell you, there's a guy out this door here, and it's the only way out of the room, and he's got a 9mm, and you can't get out here without one of these cards. Now you can all feel the pressure that you're unemployed. Okay, you're looking for paid work to get one of these cards so you can get out of here. So my tax, I've got the tax man out there, but you need one of these cards to get out of here, has created unemployment. You're all unemployed. And now you're waiting for me to tell you, okay, what do I have to do to get one of these cards? If I say you have to stay and work an hour to clean the floor, now you've got an idea of value. The first thing you're going to say to the guy next to you is, hey, I'll give you 20 pounds. You go to work for an extra hour for me. I want to get out of here now. Okay, there'll be an exchange rate based on what you think it's worth it to not have to stay an hour to clean the floor. And now these cards has an actual value. Okay, and it came from me telling you what you had to do to get it. You have to work an hour to clean the floor. You wouldn't have known that if I hadn't said that. Right? Now, if I say, and let's say that number is 20 pounds. This would be the exchange rate, because so you don't have to work an hour. People would be willing to work an extra hour. If I say, you know what, you only have to work a half hour to get this card. Now it's only worth 10 pounds. Okay, because it takes half as much effort to get it. If I say you have to work 2 hours to get it, it's worth 40 pounds. Right? That's what I mean by the government is setting the value of this. Now, does that tell you how much a bottle of water will cost based on, in terms of cars? Yes, but can that change? If it turns out there's only one bottle for everybody, that might go up to 10 cars. If there's a case of 500 bottles of water, you know, it'd be a fraction of that. You know, it'd be like cheap, a tenth of a car or something like that. And so you're going to have relative value changes, but the source of value of this card is me telling you what you have to do to get it, and then after that, the markets can figure out what everything else will be worth. It gets cold, somebody wants to buy your jacket, what I'm doing in terms of cards, you can figure it out once I tell you what you have to do to get it. Okay. Let's move down here. And notice this, if the tax is 1 card per person, and I say you have to work 1 hour, and there's 50 people in this room, I know I'm going to get 50 hours of labor. At least, I might get extras if people want to earn some more. I'll get at least 50 hours of labor. If I say I'll pay 2 cards an hour, I'm only going to get 25 hours of labor, because you guys collectively only have to work 25 hours. So when the government raises the prices it pays for things, it's increasing the price level. But it's also then able to buy less in real terms unless it raises the tax. It's a very important dynamic that's not expressed. Now normally when you have prices going up and people are paying income taxes, then the tax is going up automatically. In this case it wasn't. It was a fixed head tax, or it was a fixed property tax. If they start paying more, they're going to wind up getting less. If they wanted to get more labor, they would pay less. If I want 100 hours, I'll say a card's only worth a half hour. It's an inverse relationship. Okay, there's a paper on my website by Pavlina, did this in 1996. She was an undergrad at Gettysburg College. That was her first paper. It's very good, and it goes into how monopoly pricing works. We'll keep moving on. Okay, here's another point. In the economy, I assume that savings desires, the reason people want to save, is because of what that savings can buy. So you might want to save enough to live for 2 or 3 weeks if you lose your job. Apple Computer might have $200 billion in savings in cash on the balance sheet, because they think that's what they need to run the company for a certain time, don't want to have liquidity problems. If prices doubled, they would need $400 billion. If you need 200 pounds to go grocery shopping, and prices double, you need 400. Okay, so as prices increase, as you get inflation, what they call inflation, prices increase, you need to, the need to save, the need for some kind of money supply grows accordingly. And so what happens is that inflation creates a money shortage. Phil and I did a paper on this in Germany, the Weimar inflation. What happened? Prices were going up. It created this enormous money shortage, in which case the government had to, print money for people to exchange for their bank accounts and everything else, just to run their lives, because prices were going up so fast. You just need more money. Corporations needed more on hand to meet their payrolls and everything else. And then when the economists look at it in retrospect, they say, oh, see how the money supply went up? That caused the inflation. It's the other way around. If I start, inflation where I'm paying more and more cards for the same work, your savings in cards has to go up. The money supply you need to carry around to walk around goes up. As the value goes down, the demand for cash goes up. Okay, and we talked about the source of the price level right there. Okay. Now, the other thing people will tell you is, well, you can get the money from the banks to pay taxes, which is true. But in this case, it's because the banks are agents of the government. They're licensed, they have a charter in the U.S., they have charters, they're members of the Federal Reserve, they're fully regulated by the U.S. regulators, the FDIC and the Fed, and they can only operate under very, very tight restrictions. which has to be, otherwise the system couldn't function. It would just fall into hyperinflation, like some people imagine. And so they are authorized agents of the government, so the loans they make can be used to pay taxes. Okay, but only because the government has decided they can. And it's all under the Federal Reserve Act of Congress, which it changes as needed. And it amends the rules, like you saw with the SVB bank problem. Within a week, they've changed the rules, and those problems went away. So you have to think of the government and its agents. And when the government gives you a Social Security check, you are now the government's agent when you go spend it. The prices you pay are as an agent of the government. It didn't buy something that defines the currency. It gave the currency to somebody to go do it for them. So when the military goes out and buys things, they're acting as an agent for the government. And that whole military procurement system, the whole public procurement system, is critical in the price level. And the U.S., almost to a fault, has got its expenditures on the public expenditure side with competitive bidding and everything else, is actually a deflationary force. And it's been instrumental in keeping it price level in check to the extent that it has. So again, prices paid by government is always through its agents. The congressmen don't go out and pay the soldiers. It's done through agents. Okay. I'm going to give you one more example of how am I doing for time? Okay. Okay. So this is a good story that you can use. Elizabeth and I were in Pompeii, and we jumped on one of the tours they had. There was a tour guide, there were about 30 or 40 people, and he showed us the coins from Pompeii. And he said Pompeii was a very nice place to live because they would collect these coins for tax, and then they would spend it. They would use them to pay government employees for sanitation and for public safety. And they had good public services, so people wanted to live there even though the taxes were high. So, I'm a bit of a troublemaker. So I go to the guide and I said, well, actually, they would pay the people first and then collect the tax. And he goes, no, you collect the tax and then you pay the people. I said, well, where'd the coins come from? He said, well, the government made them, the state, Pompeii made the coins. I said, well, how did anybody get a coin to pay the tax? He said, so they would pay them first and then collect them? I said, yeah, how else can it work? He grabbed his head, he goes, no. And walked away. And the guy wouldn't talk to me for the rest of the tour. That's a true story. He's been a guide for 20 years. Right? Now, I assure you, everybody in Pompeii knew how it worked. They had a tax on everybody's house or something. Everybody owed money, and then some people would show up to get paid to be police officers and sanitation workers. They'd get paid, and then people who didn't want to do that would sell them pizzas or whatever, tomatoes, or perform services. And the place was monetized, and that's how it worked. And everybody knew that they would pay the people first who would then pay the taxes. Now, they found 20,000 coins in the street, or what would have been in somebody's pocket because it was buried under the ashes, right? Or in some merchant's coin box or under a mattress somewhere. So how did they get there? How did 20,000 coins get in the street? Because people can imagine that. You're talking to somebody, they have to understand this. Well, they came from the government. The government paid all these people more than were used to pay taxes. They were earning coins to pay the taxes for the society and to save. That was the savings in the society. The government spent 20,000 more than it collected so far. They're still finding it. Right? That's the government's deficit. They spent more than they collected. The public debt are all the coins the government spent that haven't yet been used to pay taxes. Public debt are all the pounds that the British government has spent since inception that haven't yet been used to pay taxes. Where are they? They're in the street. Well, what's the street today? The street is cash in circulation. It's reserves, which are bank accounts at the central bank, and it's gilts, which are bank accounts at the central bank, at the Bank of England. So they're either in bank accounts or they're on pieces of paper, which are deposit slips, for bank accounts at the central bank. They're central bank liabilities. That's the street today. Now, did anybody in Pompeii say, man, 20,000 coins in the street, how are we ever going to repay all those? difficult. It's not an applicable question. It's called the public debt. The accountants call it public debt. It's a liability. You've got coins out there that can be used to pay taxes. That's called a liability. You owe people the right to pay taxes for those. They've earned the right to pay taxes. They were police officers. They're just saving it, that right to pay taxes. And it's a public liability, but it's not something that gets paid back. How do the gilts get paid back when they mature? They transfer those pounds from one account at the central bank to another. And you've done the whole study if anybody wants to see exactly which accounts. But that's all there is. There's no like paying it back. It's already the money. There is no such thing as paying it back. So if you use that example, you can do it. Now, what were the coins worth? Okay, well, depends on how much they paid the police officers. You know, if a day's work was worth, 10 pizzas, because a guy could make 10 pizzas a day, and you paid the police officers 10 coins a day, then pizza might be 1 coin each. I don't know, something like that, because it's a tenth of a day's work. Right? If you start paying the police officer 5 coins a day, then it would mean the pizzas would have to cost more. They'd be worth more coins, right? So the government, if it paid 20 coins a day, then the price of the pizzas is half as much. It's what you have to do to get the funds from the government. That's what it's worth. The same as I use with the cars. And that's what this paper's about, okay? And there's examples in here that you can go through. Now, the next thing I did was look at the academic definition of inflation. A continuous increase, and I say in the term structure of prices faced by economic agents today for purchases and sales for future delivery dates. I was trying to figure out what the academic definition means. They say it's a continuous increase in prices. What prices? Kind of all the prices. What a continuous increase implies they must be going up, right? Well, if the price is increasing, it means if I want to buy, for delivery next week, it's going to be that much higher. That would be the continuous increase. If I want to buy for 5 years forward, let's say I'm a jeweler and I want to buy my gold supply for the next 5 years. I want to know what the prices are for delivery dates all the way out. Okay, and so when I pondered on this academic definition, this is what I came up with, this thing called the term structure of prices. And that's always a function of the interest rate, the policy interest rate. So if you have a zero interest rate policy, an ounce of gold today is, how many pounds would it be? Well, let's say 2,000 pounds. It's not that high. It's about 1,500 pounds probably. Okay. An ounce of gold is 1,500 pounds. Is that right? Yeah.
I don't know the prices of that.
They're trading gold. Yeah.
I think it's 1,500 pounds. I know in dollars. It's 1,500 pounds, let's say. If there's a zero, when rates are zero, if I want to buy gold for next year.
You're quite right, Warren. It is actually 1,500 quid.
Oh, it's clear. I thought it was
£1,500, sorry.
So it's 1,500 pounds. If I wanted to buy it for a year from now, what would the price be? Well, it would be the same 1,500 pounds unless there was insurance or something. Because interest rates are zero. If I'm a salesman and you want to give me the money, or you're not going to pay for it for a year, I'm not losing anything. If I get my 1,500 pounds today, I can't earn interest on it anyway. If I get it a year from now, it's the same value. But let's say interest rates go to 10%. Okay, so now if you want to buy it from me today, it's 1,500 pounds. But if I've got to wait a year for my money, I could be earning 10% of my money. I'm going to want 1,650 pounds for that coin. Otherwise, I'm not going to sell it to you for a year. I'm not going to wait a year for my money if I can't earn the interest. Okay, and the person buying it would be willing to pay that because he can take his 1,500, put it in the bank for a year, and earn 10%. He'll have 1,650. So it's fair. It's an indifference level. It's a market price. It's where buyers and sellers come together based on the 10% interest rate. If the 10-year interest rate is 10%, the price 10 years from now would be 10% compounded for 10 years. And you can see that in the futures markets when they trade. It's called forward prices. Okay? And so you could say that the price of gold right now, if interest rates were 10%, and the 10-year was 10%, the term structure of prices is increasing continuously at the rate of 10% a year. I would say that's a 10% inflation rate. And that exactly fits the academic definition of inflation. So under the academic definition of inflation, it is the policy rate, the interest rate. And so when the central bank raises interest rates, they're raising the forward price of gold versus the spot price. So if the spot price is $1,500 and they raise the rate to from 0 to 1%, and the 10-year rate, let's say, is the same, 1% for 10 years. The price 10 years forward might be 10% higher, 1650, right, something like that. But you'd see a continuous increase of 1%. If they raise rates to 2%, there's a continuous increase of 2%. So what they're doing when they raise rates is they're adjusting that term structure of prices to be growing at a steeper rate as they raise rates. They're increasing the rate of inflation by the academic definition. Okay? And so they don't even discuss that, but they know that. They know how forward prices work. Right? When they lowered rates, they've lowered the term structure of prices. They've reduced the rate of inflation faced by all of us when we try and buy something for forward delivery. So when do we ever do that? If you want to buy a house that's under construction, it's not going to be done for a year. If interest rates go up, the cost of building that house for the year, all the money tied up in materials, everything else, is going to go up by that amount. And so suddenly the price of the house right now versus a year forward, it's gone up, okay? The term structure of prices has gone up. Everything we do is affected on the cost side by the term structure of prices that the central bank's doing. So it's actually increasing inflation when it's raising rates. It's just a mathematical expression. It's not even, there's no debate here. They all know that. Okay? And so that's in the paper also, it talks about that. Okay, now the other thing is they do something else that's very important when they raise rates. And a year and a half ago, I was, where's the gentleman from Ontario? He's sitting here somewhere. There we go. I did a presentation to the Ontario's Teachers Pension Fund, $200 billion pension fund. And I said, the central bank's going to be raising rates. The Fed's raising rates. They've already announced a policy. But that's going to, and all the forecasts are now for recession. I said, but that's going to make the economy stronger, not weaker. All the forecasts were for bringing, it was going to cause unemployment to go higher to bring inflation down. I said, no, it's going to cause unemployment to go lower. Okay? It's not going to cause it to go higher. They've got it backwards. And even the MMT proponents thought I was out to lunch on this. I was completely alone on this position. I probably still am. The reasoning was fairly simple. The government is a net payer of interest to the economy. If you look in the economy and the banking system, for every loan there's a deposit. For every borrower there's a saver. So when they raise rates, they're shifting money away from borrowers who have to pay more towards savers who get more. It's a net wash. It's zero. The only way that'll affect the economy is if the borrowers get hurt more than the savers get helped. And maybe they do. You know, maybe a borrower cuts back more than a saver increases his expenditure. Maybe if rates went to 5%, borrowers cut back, I don't know, 30% or 40%, and savers don't increase their spending by all that much. They save a little. Maybe there's a difference. But in addition to that, the government's a net payer of interest on the public debt. All the money in the street, we decided to pay interest on it. Why? That's another question, but we do. Again, Pompeii never paid interest on those 20,000 coins in the street. It didn't cause inflation or anything. In fact, if they had paid interest in more coins and flooded the market with coins, don't you think that might have caused the problem? That might have reduced the value of the money? People don't have to be police officers anymore. They're just getting interest. It'd mess up the whole system. Okay? Which is my point. The government's paying interest on all these coins in the street. In the U.S., it's 25 trillion held by the public, dollars. Right? When it pays interest, that's income to everybody. Now, some of you might be in favor of basic income. Okay, I can give you reasons why it can be problematic. Okay, but how many of you think we should pay basic income, but only to people who already have money in proportion to how much they already have? Yeah, we've got one here. That's what happens when they pay interest. The interest only goes to people with money in proportion to how much they already have, which is kind of an abomination, right? This is obscene. Okay, and the U.S. government is now paying out over $1 trillion annually in interest after having zero rates. It's gone to 5.25. Okay, only to people who already have money in proportion to how much they have, paying interest on all these coins in the street to fight inflation. It's like, okay. And it didn't matter so much when the public debt was lower. It was still bad, but it kind of neutralized the difference between borrowers and savers. What they do, by the way, is called the propensity to spend interest income. And I actually had a friend, Steve Owner, who was at the Fed, and that was his job to figure this out. And I had Steve, is there a difference in it? He says, yeah, we believe there's a difference. We believe borrowers are hurt more than savers. He said, but I've been doing the econometrics for the last 10 years. I can't detect it in the data. So, in addition to that, the government's paying interest. Now, back then it wasn't so much. So when Chairman Bernanke raised rates, the economy didn't slow down, but it didn't explode either. And in fact, it collapsed when the Saudis raised oil prices to 155. And then it collapsed. Okay, but the rate increases didn't cause the damage. Public debt came down and caused damage, but that's a different story. And when he cut rates, it didn't help the economy. We didn't have the big explosion in inflation and everything that everybody thought we'd have when we went to zero rates. Japan's been at zero rates for 30 years and hasn't had any kind of an explosion in the economy. Okay? But they're just an exception. Then the US did it. Well, that was an exception. Then Europe did it. Oh, that's just an exception. Okay. So what happens when Bernanke cut rates to zero, he eliminated $400 billion of income from the economy, because that's what the savings to the Treasury was. Well, the Treasury saved money, wonderful, but the economy doesn't have it, and so it was a weakening effect. So this time around, after COVID, debt to GDP went from 35% to 100%. The public debt held by the public now, right, by interagencies, in the U.S. 100% of GDP. So when they raise rates 1%, it increases federal spending to pay interest by a full 1% of GDP. Not the first day, it's not all short term, but the present value of that is functionally equal to 1%. And so by increasing rates, the government interest payments are now larger than the military spending. Okay. It's the largest line item in the federal budget. It's the federal deficit has gone up to 8 or 9% of GDP. I can't get an exact number. Half of that's interest. Okay, and it wouldn't have been there if they hadn't raised rates. And so by raising the deficit spending that high, unemployment went down and not up. GDP growth went up and not down. Right now, Fed Atlanta is projecting 5.6% growth for this quarter. This is boom time. So we're running massive deficits during a period of ultra low unemployment. Okay? And it's feeding this boom in the United States. And it couldn't be more regressive. Rolls-Royce sales are backlogged for 4 years. You know? The $450,000 car wasn't enough. They got a $20 million car they're selling now. All this money's, it's trickle-down economics in the worst way you can imagine. But it has its effects, and it's causing this growth, okay? Exactly the opposite of what the Federal Reserve thought. They've got it backwards. Right? And so that's in the paper too. Now, where does this go? Because why did they raise rates the last time? They raised rates because, contrary to their forecasts, which were for recession, which have been for recession for the last year and a half, the economy's been growing for a year and a half. And the more it grows, it's because they haven't raised rates enough. So now they raise rates some more. And so it grows some more. So they raise rates some more. So it grows some more. This has been going on for a year and a half. And you have to ask, where does it end? And they're saying, well, eventually they're going to cause a recession or a crash. In the financial structure, the cracks are developing. There's always winners and losers, so they pick a few losers and say the cracks are developing. Then the macro numbers come out, and it's growing because they're flooding the economy with money, right? And the more it grows, the more they add to it. So Elizabeth and I were in Argentina a year and a half ago. I met with the head of the central bank there, about 4 of us, and first thing he says is, you don't need to introduce yourself. I've been reading it for 10 years. That was nice. And we went through it, and he had one of his economists said, yeah, Sergeant Wallace did this 1987 paper in the U.S. They found the same thing you do. It's like, but we've got this IMF agreement. There's nothing we can do about it. Okay. Interest rates were like 30% because inflation had gone to 25, so they'd raised rates to 30. They've been doing this for a year. Sound familiar? Okay. After we left, inflation goes to 35, so they raised rates to 40. Inflation goes to 45, so they raised rates to 50. Last week, I just saw 118% interest rate inflation. I don't know, I'm getting them confused. It was 90 a month before. Okay, unemployment's down. The economy's doing just fine. They're flooding it with pesos. Right? There's like no end to this. And what they've done is they assume, and I've been talking to mainstream economists, and you've seen the things on Twitter, they assume people don't spend any of their interest income. So it doesn't count for deficit spending. Well, then why are we growing at 5.6%? You've got to fine-tune your model here. This money is being spent because GDP, the economy is spending. That's all it is. Okay, if it wasn't being spent, growth would be at zero. Your recession forecast would be correct. But it's not correct. It's wrong. Adjust your model assumption. Well, I don't know if they're starting to do it because they just stopped forecasting a recession now. But we'll see what happens. Okay, so anyway, that's in the paper here too. Keep going. Talk about the interest expense. Hold on a second. To summarize, I see the interest rate policy as both backwards and confused. First, the rate of inflation academically defined as an expression of the central bank's policy rate. So rate hikes increase that measure of inflation. Now, I'm not saying that because the price of gold today is $1,500 and the interest rate's 5%, it's going to be $22.50 or something a year from now. That doesn't mean it's going to go there. But that means right now, if you want to buy gold for a year forward, you're going to have to pay 5% more for it. Okay. I just did that math wrong, but it's 5%. It's 1,700 and something. So you're going to have to pay more to buy it a year forward. Does that affect where prices will be a year from now? I think it does. But I don't have any tools to do the econometrics to figure that out. The central banks do. They haven't even begun to look at that to see how that will affect next year's prices. But it gets baked into how contracts are made for purchases for next year now. They're willing to pay more for labor because they're going to get a higher price. They're willing to pay more for all the supplies. You know, you have markets that sort out relative value, getting this information due to central bank policy that, for right now to buy things forward, you've got to pay more. And now markets are discounting all that. So it's in there. Now, I can't tell you exactly how to play out. It's not what I do. Okay, but I know it's a factor. Okay, go ahead. This further implies that if wages are indexed at a general price level, in the context of positive interest rate, an increase in the wage will cause a larger increase in the price level, which will then trigger a higher wage. This is on the cost side. So we've got it on both sides. And right now, of course, wages need to catch up a lot. They've fallen way behind. So I'm not saying this is a problem, I'm just saying it'll happen. Okay. And so we've got the interest rates, and we've got the aggregate demand coming from the added expense to support those higher prices implied by the interest rates. And we have incentives for higher wages so that it will circulate and be sustaining. It will self-sustain. There's nothing in there that's going to break, is what I'm saying. It's just going to keep going forever, which is what's happened in Argentina. Okay. However, in the concept, if at a 0% thing, that effect is not there. And if you notice, Japan's kept their 0% rate throughout this whole thing, and they've had the lowest inflation and the highest deficit. It's 250 or so percent, including interagency, about 160 or 70 without it. But it's still the highest deficits in the world and the lowest inflation rate. And they've got other policies that keep prices down. And they also are ruled by their exporters. They have the export-led growth narrative. And those people try to make sure that domestic prices are down, including wages. That's another problem. Just a quick word on the hierarchy of demand. All aggregate demand starts from the state. Once there's a tax in place, the funds to pay that tax come from the state. If it doesn't spend them, there is no aggregate demand outside of the state. So that's where it starts, and it goes through a filter. And I've gone into this in another paper, not so much here. It makes a difference where if the government hires everybody and pays them to do work versus gives all the money to one contractor, in the US the whole $5 trillion or $6 trillion, and has him go hire people and keep $1 trillion for himself. That, I call that the demand filter, how the demand gets from the state to the ultimate people who spend it. Makes a huge difference. And conclusion. Okay, the chapter provides a framework for the analysis of the price level. This is how to analyze the price level and inflation. So it doesn't give you all the answers, but it gives you the correct starting points and the correct framework to come up with to use to come up with an answer. So at least the answer is going to be grounded on reality, as opposed to these other answers that wind up with results where they're just doing it backwards. Okay, so you can get it right way around. The framework is that the currency itself is a monopoly. The state is setting nominal demand with its tax liabilities, as well as providing the tax credits that allow compliance with those tax liabilities. It's not complicated. I didn't give you any higher maths. The understanding entirely explains the source of the absolute nominal value of price level over time. And implied is the role of interest rates with regard to academic definition of inflation and the influence of public policy rates on market-determined expressions of relative value. So that's the paper. How many times has this been cited by other MMT academics?
Not very many.
How long has it been out? A couple of years?
Yeah.
I tried to help out with another paper I did in 2017 with Professor Damiano Silipo of Calabria. He was a very good economist there. We collaborated on, and it's called Maximizing Price Stability in a Monetary Economy. It got published in a peer-reviewed mainstream journal, the Journal of Policy Modeling. It's the #2 mainstream journal in the world, and it shows it was designed for the European Central Bank to have better meet their single mandate of price stability. It shows that an employed buffer stock gives you better price stability than an unemployed buffer stock, which is what they're using now and how to implement it. And it's published in this mainstream journal, so it was fully accepted by the mainstream community, and nobody uses that. Okay. I haven't seen anybody cite that one. In fact, they don't like it, because what it shows is that if you want to have maximum price stability, if you want the best inflation-fighting policy possible, you will use an employed buffer stock rather than an unemployed buffer stock, which is the job guarantee. But it doesn't say it's a, part of, it's a human right to a job or anything like that. It doesn't give any bleeding heart argument about why you should have full employment. It just says that the central bank, if you want to do your job and hit your price stability targets, you need to have this full employment policy. And so it's on entirely monetary grounds for fiscal responsibility, monetary responsibility, absolute price stability. This is how you do it. Now, I think that's the way to successfully get this thing implemented. But apparently nobody agrees with me. I'll leave it at that. Okay, thank you.
I said, you're going to be challenged, and I think you're all thinking, that guy was right. So there'll be a lot of things going around in your head. Now, if you're thinking, well, I think I understood most of that, good job. All right, it's complicated, and it'll challenge you. Now, you probably have a sense maybe of empowerment. You should do, because you now know more than most of the world's central bankers. All right? Seriously, you do. Now that's kind of frightening though, isn't it? Because so you've got the empowerment, but you've got the, oh no, do they really know what they're doing? So it slightly makes you feel a little bit uneasy as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some questions. Now, as Warren said, sometimes the questions that we have some pre-prepared ones, but I'm going to try and blend them. So if you've sent the question in, I'll try and make sure it's asked from these, but I'll sort of blend the two. So what I'll do is I'll probably ask a question for the audience that's been presented. Then I'll open it to you. So in the meantime, if you want to ask Warren about how come these central bankers don't know what they're doing, or anything else from his presentation, you know, please ask him that now. Obviously, if you've got more general questions, you might kind of want to kick them down the road a bit, because Warren did mention the job guarantee just towards the end, and after you've had your coffee and your cake and your brains recovered a little bit, you can come back and ask him about the job guarantee. So I've got the first question, which is from Andy Verity, and he says, in the UK last October, the bond market sell-off accelerated sharply, following a mini budget where tax cuts were announced without any matching tax rises or spending cuts. That episode was taken by those who supported austerity from 2009 to 2019 as vindication, proof that if you don't adopt at least some minimal fiscal targets, e.g. have a debt falling as a percentage of GDP, then you lose confidence in markets and bond yields, therefore interest rates, mortgages, etc. will jump, or the pound will fall, worsening inflation of imported goods. Because unlike the US, the UK, you can't count on unlimited demand for pounds around the world. It's seen as vulnerable to currency shocks or bond market sell-offs if it doesn't subordinate other policy goals to fiscal targets. Now, how do you respond to that view? It's quite a long question, so I'm going to give Warren the paper if he's forgotten what I said at the beginning.
Is Andy here?
Yeah, okay.
Hi. Good. Okay, so question is the bond market sell-off. So what does that even mean? So you have these long-term securities, the price went down, the yields went up, they're tied to mortgages. Same thing happened at the banks and people who make mortgages. They got scared. What were they afraid of? They were afraid these policies would cause inflation. Well, why do they care about that? Well, because they believe that the central banks, the Bank of England's response to inflation would be to raise interest rates. So I'm not going to make a mortgage at 6 if the central bank's going to raise them to 8. And I'm caught with a 6% loan on my books when rates are at 8, and now I've got to pay people 8 for deposits, and I'll be making mortgages at 8 or 9. This 6% mortgage is like bad investment. Right? So they were afraid of what's called the central bank's reaction function. How are the central banks going to react to higher inflation? Okay, now the Bank of Japan, inflation went up and rates are still 0. They pegged them at 0 the whole time. So that doesn't happen in Japan because their reaction function was different. Okay, and so what has happened in the UK is what you're looking at is, a response to a central bank reaction function. Where does that come from? That comes from people who've been appointed to the central bank and what their opinions are of what they should do in certain circumstances. And they've been approved by Parliament or whoever approves these people. And now you've got this institutional structure that causes exactly what you're talking about. And bless you. The answer is, to change that institutional structure. Okay, because number one, debt to GDP is 100% in the UK. They've got it backwards also. The higher rates aren't going to do what they think they're going to do, number one. And let's see, let me get to the rest of the question here. And I think the markets were probably not wrong, given the participants that will be responding to what happened. I think that if they had done that, to to enough of a degree, it would have caused inflation itself to, it could have caused inflation to go up, and it could have caused the central bank to raise rates. Now, what's happened subsequent to that is that I think the new government, or the government that actually is in there, did something similar, right? And the markets didn't respond that way because, again, they didn't see the central bank as likely to react under this government as it would have under the previous regime. Now, is that a fair statement? I haven't followed the UK particularly closely.
It's now got to the point where the bond yields are as high now as they would have been last October.
They are?
Yeah.
Okay, so they're back up there.
Yeah.
So it turned out in the policies were kind of similar.
Yeah, basically one was slow burn, one was short, one was fast burn.
Right.
They ended up in the same place.
Right. So,
You might want to say
So-
that the Office for Budget Responsibility was not consulted about that mini budget,
yeah.
and so there was a political.
So
game
look,
going
in the
on.
near term, markets can do anything. So what I can do is give you an institutional structure where you don't have to worry about this. And like in Pompeii, it's pretty hard to come up with a reason not to have a permanent zero rate policy when you're not on a gold standard or some fixed exchange rate, which we haven't been in a very long time. And Pompeii never paid interest on those coins, and it never had anything to do. There was never an inflation problem, okay? Because they understood it was about prices paid by the government. So once you understand it, you have a permanent zero rate policy. And the other thing, you don't have any government bonds. You just leave all the deficit spending that piles up in accounts at the central bank that are reserves, demand deposit accounts, overnight deposits. What do you call them?
Yeah, reserves, yeah, they're
Reserves,
called
okay, they're called reserves.
We didn't used to call them reserves, but we do now. We call
Okay.
them Americans.
Okay. They used to be called some kind of
Well, this used to be called overnight clearing accounts.
clearing accounts. That's
Yeah.
right. They're clearing balances. Okay, that's what they used to be called. Okay. This episode is those who support us here. That if you don't adopt at least some of the minimal fiscal targets, then you lose the confidence in market environment, which is very possible. And so, and this has happened in numerous places. So but you set yourself up for that, okay? And you put yourself off balance so that if somebody touches you, you're going to fall down. You haven't set yourself up on a solid foundation where that doesn't matter. And we see the same thing in the U.S., where somebody will say something or do something, some news comes out, and you'll see, what the traders call large jumps in yield. Now, how much did the actual yields jump at the
They
announcement?
went to, the announcement went up to 4.75, I think.
From where?
From about 2.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then they've done the same over 6 or 8 months.
The long-term rates jumped 200 basis points.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay, so they went up 2%. Now, they didn't go up 30% or something like that. 2%'s a lot. They probably would have adjusted after that. It was probably, panic traders. You'll see stock markets drop a lot and then come back in the same day. It happens all the time where when markets become illiquid and nobody knows what to do, you get wild swings, and that can happen. And the other thing you can do, which I propose, is you can have your mortgage funding directly from the government. It doesn't through government policy. So we have Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. We have housing agencies which give mortgages at fixed rates, and those rates can be set by the government. And if they make a mistake and they're a little high or a little low, they are. But you get a stability that way. And if you have a policy of, let's say, a permanent zero rate, you have a policy of 3% mortgages from your federal agencies. And don't forget, the banks are federal agencies. They just have different rules than these other agencies I'm talking about. Then you can have stability in those if you feel that it serves public purpose, and nothing bad's going to happen from that. There's not going to be any negative fallout from that. But we don't have that. Given the institutional structure that the UK has right now, this stuff's going to happen over and over again until it changes. And it's going to be very disruptive. You've got a disruptive institutional structure. And that disruption has real costs.
Forgive me interrupting, but just to be clear, are you
Yeah.
saying that the market correctly anticipated the bank being to do the wrong thing?
Yeah, the market anticipated what the central bank, they believed it would do, which I'll tell you is the wrong thing. But the market maybe thought it was the right thing, because the market's just people. So look, in the U.S., the market collectively, we've had a negative yield curve. The market has been assuming that the Federal Reserve is going to lower rates, okay, within 6 months. And that's where rates trade. They trade 100 or 200 basis points lower 6 months forward. And they've been wrong. Because all the yield curve is a vote by the people who are in the markets. And you're asking somebody to lend for 30 years on a mortgage. That's a tough decision. And if you panic him by saying, oh, we're going to have this program where we're going to run the deficit up and do this, and he backs off and says, I'm not going to do no more 3% mortgages, they're going to be 5 because you guys might do that. He's acting perfectly reasonable given what he knows and what they know. Doesn't mean he's right, okay, but it's a reasonable thing. So you've got an institutional structure that's set up to have this kind of volatility on uncertainty. Uncertainty is going to be matched with this tremendous volatility time after time after time. You'll see it in the currency itself. You'll see the currency fluctuate big numbers because somebody does something or says something. And then down the road you'll turn out it was a false alarm and it recorrects. But you don't know at the time. This is a market response to uncertainty. And you can set up structures to eliminate that type of thing. It doesn't have to happen. Okay, so that's the first part of your question. Do you have any more?
There was another one later, but
Yeah.
somebody
I
else.
think Patricia wanted to
No,
ask.
any more on this question? Or at least
Just wanted to
some minimal
clarify
fiscal
one
targets.
point, actually.
Okay. Or the pound will fall, worsening inflation.
Warren, sorry, I
Sorry.
just wanted to ask something related to that
Yeah.
question, because I think when
Yeah.
the issue of loss of confidence, many commentators interpreted what happened as the markets think the government is going to default on debt.
Yeah, okay, so the way you look for that is that the credit default swap premium will go up, which is a direct risk premium. And that went up in the US, during the crisis. And governments can default. Okay, they can always make the payment. They don't have to bounce a check. The Bank of England can make the payment. But in the US, the Federal Reserve can always make the payment. But they have to be instructed by the Treasury, by Congress, to make the payment. And if Congress is up against a debt ceiling and hitting the debt ceiling is instructing the Federal Reserve not to make the payment. Okay, in 1943, Japan defaulted to the United States on a yen payment. Okay, it was the middle of the war. Right? But it wasn't because they didn't have the yen. It was just a credit in the central bank. They could do it. They decided not to. So solvency is two things. Credit risk is two things. It's ability to pay and willingness to pay.
And one point about the UK institutional structure is that it would be illegal for the government to refuse to pay the debt at present, because the law requires that they do so.
The law is an act of Parliament.
And the law is an act of
So if Parliament decided to not pay, they can overact.
They can override it, but as
Sure,
it stands at
yeah.
present.
And if there was a bill in front of Parliament to decide to not pay,
Yes.
because somebody from some monetary crank group out there, not us, and convince them not to pay, then you'd see default risk going up. Not because they can't, but because the willingness isn't there. So, and I believe the U.S. was downgraded based on willingness to pay, recently. And I don't blame them. We get that close to a default because of Congress won't vote to pay. There's a real possibility that could happen. How many people, I'm not trying to pick on anybody, it's well known, Donald Trump would complete a construction project, they wouldn't pay for it. And then they'd negotiate a lower one because they didn't want to go to court. All right, so it's not because he didn't have the money, it's because he didn't want to pay them. And that's how we believe you negotiate better prices.
The only other thing there was fiscal targets.
Now let's look at this other thing, this is important. The pound will fall, worsening inflation of imported goods. The prices would be a one-time increase in imports. Because unlike the US, they can't count on unlimited demands for pounds. It's not about not being able to account for unlimited demands. It's for pounds. It's more about worrying about the value of the pound. Now, people may or may not have a certain size. The U.S. doesn't have unlimited demand. Nobody has unlimited demand. But it's about the value and about the reasons for that people collect foreign exchange. So So it's vulnerable to currency shocks. So let me just add this thing in general about the currency. The real wealth of the UK or any other country is, let's call it its pile of stuff. And your pile gets bigger with more domestic output. And domestic output is mostly a function of the number of people working. It's working plus productivity. Productivity is fairly steady, but it's employment. So when employment goes up, output goes up. And so to get your maximum wealth, you want your pile of stuff to be as large as possible, so you want full employment. The loss of wealth from unemployment is staggering. You know, the loss of wealth from unemployment in 1 year is probably more than the real losses from all the wars in the history of the country, okay, because of lost output from these people. And it's done for inflation, imaginary, I'll say, you know, people believe it, but it's for inflationary purposes, whatever. But there's a huge loss by lack of output. The other thing is your imports make your pile larger. So the more things you import, your pile gets larger. Export, iconic example, right? And so you mine gold in South Africa, you take a gold coin and you bring it up to London, and you come home with a man's suit, okay? They don't care in London what the value of the South African currency is. The rand could be up, down, they don't even care if there is a currency. One gold coin will exchange for one men's suit. And that price is not determined in South Africa, that's determined in world markets. In Australia, I used to say the boats full of coal leave Newcastle for Hong Kong and they come back full of television sets. And they exchange coal for television sets as world prices. It doesn't matter what the level of the Australian dollar is, or if it goes up or down, or even if there is an Australian dollar. They just don't care, right? What the currency does matter for is who has to dig the coal and who gets to watch the television set. Who has to mine the gold and who gets to wear the men's suit. That's what the value of the currency is about. It's a distributional issue in your nation, and that can always be addressed with fiscal policy, with all kinds, which is entirely distributional, right? And it is addressed continuously with fiscal policy and with other legislation. And so if the drop in the currency is not going to alter the real wealth of the UK. The real wealth is still going to be there. You're still at full employment. You can always sustain that domestically. Your exports will trade for a certain amount of imports. They don't care what the level of the pound is. That's not going to change. And but what will change is the distribution. Who has to do the work and who gets to drive around in the imported cars. And that can be addressed by internal policy if it's adverse. And you can have things in place to ensure that it works in favor of the electorate, whatever that means. And so, yes, the currency can go up or down, and it's not a desired thing, it's disruptive, I understand all that. But at the end of the day, it's not affecting your real wealth, it's affecting your distribution, and that's easily remedied or readily remedied by domestic policy. Okay, so it's not as big a deal as you think. And if you look at, the pound's gone from $5 to $1.25 over the last 100 years or something. Yet the real GDP's gone up, the real standard of living's gone up. It's not, it hasn't like crushed your real wealth or anything. Has it affected distribution? Sure. Do you have internal policies for distribution? Yeah. Okay, and so, again, be careful about where you put the emphasis on when the currency moves. It's not taking anything away from the nation. Okay, and I'm not saying it isn't a problem, but it's a different problem.
Okay. Question.
One follow-up on that.
Oh, sure.
Warren, I do agree with you what you're saying about the real currency worth and what it buys and doesn't buy. But I think more importantly in the UK, we are energy importers, right?
Yeah.
So if your currency falls, it plummets, you will end up paying more in energy imports. How do you square that too? Because at some point we feel that, and we felt that, right? So
You're not
in an
paying
energy
more.
importing economy, you have to
Yeah.
be
You're
wary,
not-
or you're buying in dollars, right?
Yeah,
your energy.
You're not. Yeah, but you're getting more for your exports in terms of pounds. So
But
you're
the average person, they don't care about that.
right. That's why I'm saying it's a distributional issue.
Exactly. So I think the
Yes.
problem is in this room we
Yes.
all understand the
Yes.
techniques of macroeconomy, right?
Yeah.
But you talk to an average bloke who works, who's
Right.
delivering parcels for a living.
Yeah, it's critically important.
Exactly, right? So for
and,
him,
and it's regressive, right?
exactly. So,
So-
my point is
so
that
you-
I think we're talking like
Right, but
in a
you don't want
vacuum out
public,
here.
but you don't want public policy necessarily to stabilize the pound if it's going to reduce your real output, your real wealth. What you want is to have some kind of a subsidy for energy. So that-
Exactly. So like
it doesn't-
fiscal transfers,
Yeah.
fiscal transfers,
Yeah,
like,
you want
like what
some-
Japan did, right?
Which you already have.
No, we have enough though.
What's the tax now on energy coming in? It's probably, if how much does like a liter cost for your car now?
I don't drive, so I don't know. So, but I'm a cyclist, so
£1.50.
Okay, and what's the cost of the product?
Probably about, I think the tax on it's about 60-70%.
70% tax. So you could have the tax adjust, and so the price stays the same, right? Because the tax now is 70%. You can have the tax adjust
exactly.
for the price to stay the same.
But see, there lies the problem. Though. The problem is this is myth around the entire policy making. You know,
Yeah.
that you can't bring taxes down because taxes pay for stuff.
Right.
That's the problem.
No, I
right?
understand. But what I'm saying is the tax you have now is already causing it to be a lot worse. You know, it's worse than the pound going down. You put a 70% tax, that's like the pound going down, 70% if you didn't have the tax.
Right.
And so, you're already creating a worse problem with this tax than the pound depreciation's ever created. All I'm saying is you can reverse some of that regressive taxation. You've got a hugely regressive tax on fuel. It only affects people of low income.
Right.
And then the pound goes down to affect people. Oh, so now we have to have policy to stabilize the pound, and we're going to put you out of work on top of not being able to, on top of taxing you for fuel. It just adds insult to injury. Okay, so that's why I'm saying domestic policy adjustments make a lot more sense than anything that's going to take away your real wealth.
We've probably got a chance for the chap at the back. I think he's waiting along with us.
I've got a question, but I just wondered if you
Yeah.
want to break now. I mean, I'm desperate for a little. It's a really good question about.
Precious speaker.
Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah. Does it work?
This will have to be the last one.
Yeah. You talked before about your turning the trash into cash example with your business cards. The first one is, did you actually impose that on your children? Did they actually accept it?
I did it for a couple of days, and then, I didn't want to deal with it.
And then the other one is, you talk things up, that it seems to me that the source of the knowledge of the source of the price level starts with the government, and the origin of money being from the government and taxation.
Well, I don't say the origin of money, but I'm
Sorry,
saying
I mean in the sense that
the currency that we're using now is tax-driven, yeah.
Yeah. Given we've got examples, Pompeii, Virginia pound, even things like the US.
Tally sticks.
Yeah, any time someone introduces currency, why is this lesson continually forgotten?
Yeah, there was a time when everybody knew this, right? Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. I mean, everybody knew this thousands of years ago. Tribute money from Rome is all this is pretty obvious. It got lost about, a couple of 250 years ago. Somehow the knowledge got lost. Mitchell Innes wrote about it, but he was unknown until somehow he got on my website. He was a lawyer, I think. But I don't know how I found it. Somebody must have sent me a link. But I think it got lost when they started making the funds convertible, gold standards. And when you had kings who apparently weren't the sharpest people, I don't want to insult anybody. And then the bankers around them got them convinced of what they had to do to fight a war. And it was, we think we had lobbyists then. Those were pretty serious lobbyists who could convince the king that he needed to go into debt to a money broker. And I don't know, it just got lost. But even then, when I was at Cambridge for a while, working with some people there, I ran into a guy who studied Alfred the Great. And I started mentioning this to him. He says, yeah, that was interesting because he had coins like that. And the further you got from London or whatever, the less they were used. And yeah, they were tax-driven coins. And he had, everybody knew about this. This was not any kind of mystery. It was pretty simple. But somehow it's gotten lost, and it's just killing us. I don't know what else to say. But all these obvious policy options that are right there at hand are considered not viable because we've got the money story backwards, right? And I think that's why you're all here. Yeah.
Well, we'll see you back maybe. Immediately after that, then all the sort of content will have come from Warren, and then that's really over to you. I've got a few more questions I've already been sent, and I'll interchange those with your own. So I'll hand over to Warren, a bit on job guarantee, maybe a little bit more on the trade question, then it's over to you for questions. In terms of like the exchequer stuff, we've got Neil is an expert on the British exchequer system, how it fits in with, you know, central bank and everything else. Everything else other than that, well, we've got the great man here, so that'll be over to him. So I'll hand over to you.
Okay, so first I'll go back to I have my business card here. And I put a tax, costs you one of these to get out of here. You're all unemployed. And then I offer you a job. Why do I do that? Because it's a human right for you to have a job? No. It's got nothing to do with it. I want this carpet cleaned, right? You didn't have to do that before I put the tax on. I've added, this is something in addition, okay? And then there's 50 of you, but I say, but I'm only going to spend 45 cards. First 45 get jobs, the last 5 don't. Now there's unemployment residual. We had 50 unemployed, now there's 5 residually unemployed. Like, whose fault is that? This is my fault. I did this. Okay, this is almost malicious, right? It's some kind of wrongful imprisonment to have you in this room because I put a tax and then I wouldn't let you come earn a card. How do we remedy this? I give you a job to earn a card, or I give you a card, or I lower the tax. I say the tax is only half a card for everybody, and now there'll be jobs that pay 45 cards. Okay, but to have these people out of work, and then have people demanding that I give them work because it's a human right, isn't the strongest argument in the world to get this done. Okay? The argument for the job guarantee at the monetary level is the government has created 10 million unemployed, only hired 3 million. Now there's 7 million still out there. And it's like, oh, you know, these people are entitled to work because it's a human right to work. And it's not me. You can look up the legislation in front of Congress, put out help from beginning to end by MMT proponents. And the reasons they have this job guarantee is because under some United Nations it's a human right, or under Franklin Roosevelt said it was a human, something like that. And it's just immoral to not let people work. Well, work is a real cost. It just sort of perverts the whole thing. And I'm not saying people don't have a human right to work. I know the literature. They do. Okay? But there's a better, stronger, first order argument going on here that is left out. And that is, it should be saying, whereas people are the government created the unemployment by design in the process of provisioning itself, and then created more unemployed than it wanted to have, than it hired. It has an obligation, maybe even a constitutional obligation, because it's almost like wrongful imprisonment. It has an obligation to either hire those people, it costs to be unemployed in public service, or to transition them back to the private sector. Because you were all in the private sector doing something, whether it's shopping or working or something, until I put a tax on there, and then I extracted you out of the private sector. Your labor now belongs to me because it's my tax collector with the 9mm. Right? And I've either got to give you a job to let you out of the room, or let you out of the room somehow, or it's wrongful imprisonment, right? And so that's why I think that when it's framed that way, and it's easily understood that way, it's not hard to understand, it's actually easier. That, you know, and a good example is, you know, I had that debate with Robert Murphy, you remember that at NYU? Rohan Grace set it up, that was masterful on his part. Legal department, really well done. John Carney was the moderator, CNBC. And he is now a Breitbart, I think is pronounced right, news, couldn't be more right-wing, and he fully supports the job guarantee because he wants to see these unemployed back in the private sector. And when they're back in the private sector, they're producing more useful output, and it makes everybody, it's adding to our pile of stuff. It makes the nation wealthier. So like, why aren't we doing this? Well, we don't understand the monetary system. Expense will go up. You might get a 0.2 of an adjustment. The price level one time, you won't get any inflation. Okay, but it's not getting done. So he wants to see it get done, and yet the left that's actually getting these things up front won't present it that way. And when I actually went on Twitter and said, I think, to me, I would lead with the monetary side of it, showing that A, it's enhancing price stability, we've got an inflation problem, and B, the government, I say A, the government caused this, it has probably a legal obligation to make it right, and B, it's anti-inflationary. So let me get into the anti-inflationary part. Right now, we use an unemployed, and I touched on this earlier, we use unemployment to fight inflation. When the Federal Reserve starts raising rates, they're saying, yes, unemployment will go up a little bit, but that's the cost of bringing inflation down. That's our buffer stock. The more unemployed they feel, it puts downward pressure on inflation. When unemployment gets too low, like it is now, 3.5% instead of 50-year low, telling them it's because they haven't raised rates high enough. I can tell it's because they did raise rates, but they've got it backwards, right? They've been trying to push it up and it's been going down. And they were severely criticized for engaging in a policy that was going to cause higher inflation, including a lot of MMT proponents. And they should be criticized for intending to do that. But the actual effect of the policy is to bring unemployment down, right? They are petrified with unemployment at this level because that's the net. It's like a trapeze artist. Their net is unemployment. That's their buffer stock against inflation. And once that's gone, then any price pressures just turn into runaway wage demands in their mind. And we get something we haven't seen, and we still haven't seen, and they agree we haven't seen it, which is wage-driven inflation. And the reason we haven't is because there's excess, in their minds, excess capacity, and but now they see inflation hovering around the lows. Unemployment claims every week at a ridiculously low level. They're petrified that if they've made a mistake and inflation comes back, they have nowhere to go. They're stuck. So anyway, so we've got unemployment as a buffer stock. If we can make the case that an employed buffer stock, which is what you have in a job guarantee, it's a buffer stock, is a better inflation fighter than unemployment, that's all you need. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's not going to stop the Saudis from raising the price of oil, right? Okay, but if it stabilizes the labor market, it acts like an employment agency so business can hire these people. It's a transition job, and so it keeps, wage pressures contained at least as well as unemployment does, and maybe better. It only has to be as good, really. Then there's no reason not to go to that. Okay, it doesn't have to be perfect. You know the story about, you don't have to outrun the bear. The two guys are walking, and one of them says, "What if we come across a bear?" He says, "Oh, I'm going to run." He says, "You can't outrun the bear." He says, "I don't have to. I only have to outrun you." The employed buffer stock only has to outrun unemployment. In fact, even if it's equally good, because unemployment has so many negative externalities, they call them, of crime and everything else that goes with it, and broken families, and all kinds of issues, even if it's just as good. But we can show that it's better, okay, because it's more liquid, because you can interview businesses. There have been studies done that show business prefers hiring people already working and doesn't want to hire the unemployed. And in the last cycle, famously, there were signs in the news, help wanted, must be employed. They just don't want it because people, once they're unemployed, they might be on drugs, they're not clean, they get in fights or something. They want somebody who's working, comes in every day as a supervisor. Their odds of being employed are way up, and it's costly today to hire somebody. Labor's protected, which it should be, but it adds a cost to hiring somebody if they don't work out. It's a problem. Okay, so those are the two ways that I think it could get implemented immediately, because most people are in favor of it. Okay, so understand it's far better than unemployment at controlling inflation. And number two, it's caused by government policy, and all we're asking to do is stop that policy of putting on a tax to create unemployment and then not hiring those people that you just caused to be unemployed, presumably because you wanted to employ them as government. Why else would you do this? You know, when the Europeans went into Africa and put a hut tax where if you didn't pay your tax, we're going to burn your house down. People showed up to work at the plantations. They gave them all jobs, all right, let them earn all the cards they wanted. They used some kind of script. And then people paid their taxes. They didn't do this and then not hire the people so they could go burn their houses down. Okay, why would they do that? Nobody did that. But that's what we're doing. That's what the European Union's doing. That's what the UK is doing. Okay, they're putting a tax on everybody's house. They're not letting people earn enough money to handle it, and then they go and burn your house down. No, they're not burning them down, but they're burning your life down with this unemployment thing that they've created. It's malicious, it's wrongful. Let's say it's unintentional, okay, because they don't know this story. Now, if it was intentional, I'd be giving them more credit than they deserve, because I know a lot of these people, and they're not that good to be able to figure this out, to do it. They are, and it's more damning to call it, innocent fraud than malicious about who these people are and what they're doing. And, okay, so that's the job guarantee. And so how does that affect you? Like, I saw Pavlina a few years ago. I think she doesn't do this anymore, but it's a good example. She was on Bloomberg television. She talks about the job guarantee, and Bloomberg said, well, what are all these people going to do? And she says, oh, there's lots of useful work out there. It's like, wrong answer. They're going to transition to private sector jobs. That's what they're going to do. Okay. When they hear that, it's like, okay, who's against that? By giving them things to do, it says whatever they're doing, it's going to help them get back into the private sector, because the private sector likes to hire people already working. That's how you lead with that kind of a question. And they say, well, what are they actually going to do? Well, one thing I've suggested is qualifying nonprofits can be allowed to pay the job guarantee wage, whatever it is, $15 an hour, to anybody who comes to work for them. Okay, and then those people will transition in. Why would we do that? So those people can transition into the private sector. In the meantime, they're working for qualified nonprofits, not just anybody. And so that'll work out. We'll let agents of government hire assistants knowing they can't give them a raise, they're temporary, because these people are going to be very attracted to the private sector and they're going to transition back to the private sector. So keep it out front that the point of this whole thing is to transition people to the private sector. Well, what about all the things that need to be done in the public sector? Those people need to be hired anyway in the normal course of public sector hiring, not some kind of job guarantee program. Why? Because you're undermining hard-earned gains and well-deserved gains in the public sector. Whatever you think a nurse is making at the NHS, it's not enough. It would be half that with all the work and labor and organizing and everything else that got them to levels that we still think are too low, for example. And if you start hiring job guarantee people to start being their assistants and working in their positions at half as much, you're just undercutting this whole thing. And you don't need to do that. Okay, the government can hire people at the normal going public sector wage without any problem whatsoever, with no damage to the economy. In fact, it helps everything. Okay, and you're getting much more professional staff in there doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so, Bill Mitchell wants lifeguards that can help people learn to swim and can teach them guitar. Fine, just have it regular public sector people under normal public sector wages. You don't bring in $15 an hour people. And the answer is, well, yeah, but they're never going to do that. Well, that's a different question. Answering in the first order, getting people, to understand what it's about is different than what might wind up as a compromise. And I don't know that it will. Okay, you might not get any of this, but so this little talk is about framing this thing. So first, fully provision of public sector. The government's caused 10 million people in the U.S. to become unemployed. It's hired 3 million. Hire whoever you need to fill in government to do what it's supposed to be doing. Have enough police officers or whatever you want. Have enough public health people, whatever you want. Have enough public school teachers, crossing, whatever. You got 7 million you've already caused to be unemployed. Use it. If there are any left, which there will be, that you actually don't want, even though you can afford it, let's get them back into the private sector by offering them a transition job so that they're attracted to the private sector. And move those people back. Now when you do that, private sector output goes up because the private sector is going to have 3 million more people than it has now working. And everybody knows private sector jobs are real jobs that produce real output, right? You don't have to worry about arguing that because nobody's going to challenge you on that one. Except me maybe, but nobody else is going to challenge. So the real wealth of the country will go up according to their output because their output will go up more than their consumption. The guy who takes this job, is he going to consume more in real terms or not? Well, he's already eating 3 meals a day probably. He's probably already driving around. He's already got someplace to live. How much additional is he going to have? It's going to be less than his output. Because the private sector only hires you if they're paying you less than your output, right? So we know there's going to be more output for the rest of us by having these 3 million back to work. Plus, he's not going to consume any more by the amount of his income. It'll be a lot, his additional consumption, if anything, will be a lot less than that. And they'll say, well, he's going to import more. You know? It's like, okay, so the distribution of imports will change slightly. Are these people going to have more cell phones than they have now that are imported? I don't know. It's trivial. It's not anything anybody would care about. Total wealth has gone up. Total imports that we can, our exports will go up and imports will go up. It'll get dwarfed in the, it pays for itself, to use the wrong term. Have you heard this anecdote about Argentina when I was there? It'll take 2 minutes for this. So Daniel Cazar, I don't know if you know the name, he was at the labor ministry in Argentina. And in 1998, he had read my paper, Full Employment Price Stability, which is where the job guarantee came from, which came from self-currency economics. I had one paragraph. Paul Davidson, as economics professor, said, that's not enough, you got to expand. It's a good paper, self-currency economics, but you got to expand on that. So it's all right there, what do you need, Paul? He said, no. So we make a paper and show the debits and credits and all this. And it's called Full Employment Price Stability, 1997. Daniel finds out about it in 1998, comes to UMKC, studies it. 3 years later, in 2001, the 1-to-1 peg for the peso breaks, 32 dead in the street in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. It's a horrible scene. And they float the peso, and Daniel comes in with the job guarantee. It's called the Jefes de Hogar plan. They offered a job to all heads of households in Argentina. And they got and these were people nobody ever thought would work that took this job. They had 2 million people come into the program over the next couple of years. And the whole population was only like 33 or 34 million people. And they were having we went down there, they had little like soup kitchens for kids, and they were digging, infrastructure, water projects and stuff for themselves. And over the next couple of years, 1 million of them transitioned into the private sector. And the wealth of Argentina went up. They had the best economy in the world. They were growing at 9%. It was doing well. So anyway, a few years later, Daniels leaves. The guy behind him, he had a budget, decided he wanted to use it for something else, ignored the program. It was kind of a residual program, let it wind down. And they start facing labor shortages again. And so Daniel's there, we need to come down and make a presentation about what they can do about these labor shortages, reopen the Jefes plan. So I go down there, we flew down with Jan Kregel and his wife, he's a UN economist, and Daniel. We go into this meeting, about 20 people, we're all in our suits. And this was a progressive institute in Argentina. And maybe half of them were from the central bank and the other half were from this institute. I start explaining, going to my presentation about they can offer a job to anybody willing and able to work. And the front man says to me, he says, well, how much would you pay these people? So I said, well, what's the minimum wage in Argentina? And he said 600 pesos a month. Back then it was $200 a month, which was nothing even back then. And I said, well, maybe half that. Because what we discovered in the program is that people came in because they wanted to work. In one of the interviews, Pavlina, who went down there to do research on the program, said, would you rather come in and work or just get the paycheck and stay home? And every one of them said they wanted to come in and work. And half of them transitioned. So it was just a big myth that people just wanted to get paid, at least there, with that group of people. So So I said maybe half that, 300 pesos a month, which was $100 a month or something. And this guy says to me, quote, are you listening carefully here? If those people, calls them those people, get paid that much money, he said, some of them might eat some meat. This is Argentina, right? That's what he said. So Daniel, who's Argentine, he's a administrative, he just turns red. He said, Craig Leon from the UN's going, I told you about these people. This is supposed to be you don't think it's a real, it looks like a first world country, Buenos Aires on the surface. So, I don't miss a step. So I said to him, I said, well, look, if the purpose of your current institutional arrangements are to make sure a substantial portion of your population can never afford to eat any meat, you're already doing a good job and you really don't need to hear the rest of this presentation. So he's not fazed by that. He turns around to the others, he talks in Spanish for 2 or 3 minutes, and I asked Jan later what he was saying. He said he was talking about whether people should eat meat or not. I didn't know what he's talking about. He turns back and he says, well, we've decided that it might be okay if those people ate some meat, so we'd like to hear the rest of your presentation. But you're up against some institutional structures there that are pretty serious, right? And they never did this because they really were worried about some people eating some meat. So, and in the UK particularly, don't underestimate what's left of the class structure, right? Because it's lurking back there. I don't know it is. It might be lurking back there, okay, at some level. Now, I know it's a democracy here.
Somewhat.
I know you have a House of Lords.
Only a name.
It's a House of Lords, but it's a democracy.
We have a monarchy as well, so it's not
And
democracy.
you have a monarchy that doesn't spend all that much money, only about 10% of GDP or something. And, so yes, you do have this element there. So anyway, and that might be part of the job guarantee issue, that some people might eat some meat, and that never gets mentioned. There they just said in public. Here, nobody would even dream of hinting at that, but it could be what they're thinking in the backs of their minds. Okay, any questions on that?
I think I better open the floor. I already mentioned the trade in real wealth earlier, so given we've only 20 minutes left, we may take some questions. I'll take one from the gentleman there.
Could you say something about the importance of the design of the tax system in achieving public purpose?
I mean, that's about a 10-minute answer, which I'd like to do, but I want to see if there's anything else quick, and then that's important.
Is there anything
definitely
quick?
want to do that.
The chap here,
Yeah, one quick question, Warren. Could you explain on the left there's a big push about UBI and why job guarantee is better than UBI?
Okay, so that's a quick one, so I'll do that first.
Yeah.
So, you all owe me one card to get out of the room. You can earn one card to do the floor. But you know what? I'm going to give you all one card for UBI. Everybody leaves and the floor doesn't get done. It threatens the ability of the government to provision itself. Now, if I give you half a card UBI, okay, I'll get half as much time on the floor. Okay, but why would I do that? Why wouldn't I just change my card, my tax, and my spend? All right, now what it can do is if you have a society that's so complex because of the tax codes and everything else, that rather than try and undo that, you can put this kind of a Band-Aid on it to help some issues. That's fine, but the risk is, if you let that thing creep up high enough where everybody walks out the door and nobody's cleaning the floor, the government has lost its ability to provision itself with the currency. It's called hyperinflation. And it's pretty easy to understand how it happens when you look at it at the model level. Same thing in Pompeii. If they said, we'll give UBI to everybody, so it's enough to pay the tax, then you don't get any police officers. The whole exercise is about the government trying to provision itself. That's what the monetary system's about. This is very important. I'm glad you brought this up. The mainstream will say money came around to facilitate trade and it was better than barter, it was complicated, and it helped people organize their lives and to save and all this stuff. I'm saying it's for the government to provision itself. It's got nothing to do with it. This is a coercive system. How does the government provision itself? Well, you used to have a system where, you go out to a bar and you wake up on a boat with a bump on your head, right? You're in the Navy. That's one way the government can provision. So we pretend to be more civilized, right? We put a tax on everybody's house, and if you don't work for the government, we burn it down.
Sorry, the chap there, sorry, I'll take you next. The chap in the far corner.
And I'm saving your...
Warren,
Yeah.
I've followed you for a few years, but one thing that's always bothered me is if a nation like the UK decided to default politically on our debts, but then at the same time tried to say that it was necessary, where would we kind of be with our philosophy or our...
You'd be in an illogical place, right? Because it would be kind of like an asset tax. You're taxing everybody with money in the Bank of England in this case. You're saying your balance has gone from £1 million to zero, right? Now maybe that requires Parliament to vote it as a tax. It's part of your taxing authority. Maybe that's actually a tax rather than default. I don't know. But it's anybody who understood what they were doing would never do it, because you don't gain anything. What does the state gain by doing that?
Yeah.
There's no gain. All you cause is disruption. It doesn't help. It doesn't keep. There's no gain of real wealth in the economy. It's just disruption, which causes people not to work, and you lose your real wealth. So it's just kind of a suicidal move. That's why nobody actually does it. Even in the worst banana republic with the highest debt, they go to the central bank and it's zillion trillion pesos to pay the debt. Just print it. Credit the accounts. Like, why not? If you credit the accounts, you can keep the thing going. You can keep paying the army. You can keep people in. You redenominate. The point is to run the government. Why would you do anything that causes you to not run your own government? I'm not saying you won't. Russia did that. In 1998, Russia, at the central bank, when they ran out of reserves, instead of just floating the currency because they didn't understand it, they just got up and walked out. They didn't even turn the lights out. And there were no rubles cleared for like 3 months or something by the central bank. And people started trading what they called arrears. It's a very interesting name to put on debt, call it arrears, which it is. I thought that's clever. And then when they came in, they credited all the accounts and everything was okay. So now, I left my firm at the end of '97. The Russian crisis was in '98, August '98, and I had talked to the guy who was running the book with that stuff. I said, we should go to Russia, talk to the central bank like we did with Italy, just so things happen. They run out of reserves. They at least know which buttons to push. He said, no, we don't want to do that because the spreads will go away. And I said, okay. Anyway, that's why I left. I didn't just want to deal with this guy in my firm who had that attitude of not recognizing that would have protected. And instead, his fund went from 500 million to zero, right, because of that. Anyway.
Yeah, there's a chap here.
Yeah, it's just a follow-up on the UBI question there.
Yeah.
So I've been in several lectures by people talking about UBI and stuff like that. And as soon as you start, they're all coming at it from the socially...
Yeah.
And as soon as you start mentioning economics, they look at you like you're some kind of a devil that's speaking in tongues or trying to... As soon as you mention economics, they just don't want to know because they think you're there to talk with
That's your problem, not mine. Yeah, and it might happen because of that. It might happen, and we might get hyperinflation.
Yeah.
I don't know. But I can tell you why it doesn't work fundamentally. But it's okay at a limited point, but it goes past the tipping point.
It's not just the...
Okay, so now the real thing. So
I was just thinking I ought to see if Michael was here. Is Michael here? Because Michael politely submitted his question early, so I ought to ask him that. Then I'll go back to the floor. I'll keep an eye on the clock. It's about inequality. MMT argues that a trade deficit is a good thing for the West. Warren specifically mentioned this in his writings. However, if exporting countries like China are either...
Okay, now first the word a good thing. I would say it's an economic benefit.
Okay. You got to be careful with Warren.
There's a difference.
Yeah.
Isn't that a good thing, Warren?
Yeah.
Good thing I thought of that.
Yeah. They're all long questions, the ones from the floor. So, however, if exporting countries like China either fix the currency artificial raw rate or keep wages low relative to productivity in order to be competitive, doesn't this automatically mean that labour in the West will also be forced to accept lower wages? Is it logical to say the fundamental source of inequality in the West is principally due to predatory practice overseas, which have destroyed well-paying manufacturing jobs?
The short answer I'd say is no. The U.S. has some of the highest wages and the largest number of imports. So it doesn't need to do that at all. It can be completely the opposite. If you look at the high-wage countries, their imports are all high. So it's not. Now, you can have an institutional structure that does that, but it's not necessarily the case. It's not the imports per se that would cause that.
Yeah.
Is it fair to say the firms themselves can use overseas competition, the cheapness of labour overseas, as a way to drive wages down? I know that's not a macro question, but that's, that does happen, I think.
Yes, but it's still, again, the U.S. is a pretty high wage country, and the average wage for an auto worker, and there's plenty of competition, is probably $60, $70 an hour.
But that's what Apple did, right? Apple offshore all their manufacturing to China.
Yeah.
Because
but what happens?
They want to pay the salaries to the American engineers, right?
Right. So what happens is the remaining jobs pay more, just as a matter of market forces, and that could be jobs at Google or Facebook or something, whatever they're doing there. And then they'll outsource, but then the remaining jobs pay more. And if you look at our unemployment rate at 3.5%, if you look at wages over time, they're going up. And so you can confuse the micro for the macro, so to speak. And so it's not the case that the total wage thing is held down by that. Now we've got a more important thing going on. And the more important thing going on just obviates the whole Phillips curve, which is that people work to eat. And business only hires if it feels like it, if it likes the return on equity. So it's a disparity of power. So as your first elementary game theory, it's not a fair game.
Yeah.
Okay, and so that tends to keep wages suppressed over time unless there's some kind of outside support, which used to be labor unions, let's say, which isn't anymore because subject to unionization is smaller and smaller. So those places will do okay, but the rest isn't. And so you need some kind of support, and in this case from government, because there's nobody else left, I don't think, which would be the job guarantee. And you can set that minimum compensation at any level you want to ensure that real resources are going to the bottom, to the lowest income groups. And so and it's used interestingly in a place like Turkey. You'll see this wild inflation going on. And then you'll see the government raise the minimum wage by 50% or 100% to make sure that their constituency, who's working people earning minimum wage, keep up. Then everybody else has to fight for the scraps. So it's actually a progressive thing in that country, in that context. A lot of other things aren't progressive, but that is. And they'll do that, and they'll sustain their constituency to vote for them. And the inflation allows them to do that because it crowds everybody else out and allows them to allocate real resources to their constituency through the minimum wage.
It's Adam in the corner, I think.
So really quick,
What?
really interested from the point of convincing people.
You can't hear anything. You can't hear anything.
Shout, Adam.
From a point of view of convincing people, I think it's really important. In 2008, you had a meeting with President Bush and
Oh, yeah.
and his administration.
Right.
What do you think it was that made them do that and change the mind?
He wanted to get elected. So, but what?
That was the end of his term. 2008 was the end of his term.
What's that?
Wasn't it 2008?
He was running for, no, it's 2002.
Oh, okay.
And he was running in 2004. Well, let me get to this. This is good. So Stephanie Kelton had me come to her class at Stony Brook, and she had all these left-wing activists in the class. Andreas Bernay, anybody know him?
Yeah, no.
Yeah. Okay. So, so I get up there, and I talk about why we should eliminate the income tax and sales tax, transaction taxes, income tax. And I go into the real compliance costs. So the real compliance costs of income taxes, I thought were at least 10% of GDP. These are all the people tied up in record keeping, which is including individuals, all the tax preparers, all the tax departments at all these major corporations and minor corporations in tech, all the universities that teach tax, all the overseas structures and all the lawyers and JP Morgan spends like $10 billion a year on tax matters, accountants and taxidermists or wherever else they use. And all the legal system with tax law and all the time spent there and the people going to school to learn tax law and lawyers. And it comes out to like 10% of GDP. And I talked to a friend of mine, Raj Syed, University of Chicago, in a business school, and I pointed out, he says, well, I think it's a lot higher. So, the dead weight costs of just income tax without sales, it's like 15% of GDP. And they're smart people, so it's a huge brain drain. So if you eliminate all the income tax, all those people are out of work. Okay, and they will get redeployed into the regular economy. And let's say you do it into public services, transportation, education, health, and everything else. Who benefits most from those services? Well, it's the lowest income groups benefit the most, because the people at the highest income groups got their own transportation, their own health care. So it's the lowest income groups benefit from all that. And it's at nobody's expense. Business is happy because they don't have to deal with this income tax. They don't have to keep any records. The government doesn't even have to know who you are. I replace it with a property tax. I don't want to get in an argument with that, but with real estate tax, where they don't even have to know who owns the house. If it doesn't pay, they just sell it, right? So we already have it set up. There's zero compliance costs for all practical. So now, if you look at the percentages, you're increasing the real standard of living of the lowest 30, 40% of income earners by, I don't know, 50 to 100%, okay, in real terms, by eliminating the income tax, which is there because it's progressive to help the lowest income people because they don't have to pay it. Well, it's actually hurting them because they're paying the real compliance cost, because these are real people that would be performing services that they'd be using. Okay, and so the tax is critically important, and nobody looks at the real compliance costs, which are taking away our real wealth. It's all dead weight stuff. It's all people digging holes and then filling it in. And so when you look at a tax, look at that. Look at the least costly in terms of real resources. And I come up with just a flat property tax to replace everything, which might be pretty high. It might be 10% or 12%. But the other thing that does is for the resident, he's not paying any more. It's all in his property tax, but he's not paying any more because it's the same money, roughly. Okay. But for the non-resident, who didn't pay income tax, they didn't live here, he just owns a house in London, now he's paying 12% of his $10 million place. That's a lot of money for the guy. And it takes away its value as an investment to have 12% being voted. And so you get rid of that distortion of having the city half empty with all these absentee owners who now have to subsidize the Queen directly, with their taxes and all the other overhead of the country, rather than just whatever property tax is doing locally. Because property taxes have always been local. So,
is it Carol? Is the front there?
I just said. So anyway, the question is, how important is taxes to have proposals? I've had that since soft currency economics, to replace it all with a property tax. Carol thinks just land and not property would be better. I don't want to get into that here. But go ahead. Did you have another question?
But just to say that, you said about abolition of income tax,
Yeah.
which I totally agree with,
Yeah.
but we do need to distinguish between earned income and unearned income. Income tax here
Yeah.
is paid at the same rate whether it's earned
Yeah,
or
but here I
unearned.
wouldn't tax any of it.
But that's not what I want to say.
Okay, because of compliance costs.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but anyway, I finished the class, and they all get it. Okay, and they recognize the most progressive thing we could do would be to drop the income tax. It's a simple thing to do. Replace it with a property tax, which is already in place. So you just change the 1% local property tax to 10 or 11, and give it to the federal government, send a check. So it's very, very simple. And getting rid of the income tax makes it, but they were speechless, okay? Because it just went against the grain to not tax higher income people at a higher rate, even though they know in practice they only pay 10 or 12 anyway. They just couldn't bring themselves to do it, and it just got lost, and they acted as if they never heard it. You know, so, okay.
Okay, right. When I applied to do an economics degree as a mature student, I had quite a lot of trouble. I had to write an essay. It wasn't very good, but it was based on the definition of economics by Lionel Robbins, which is that what's the right word? The allocation of resources with
Scarce resources,
Scarce
unlimited
scarce
ones.
resources with alternate uses. Okay. So, is it not true that there are two ways that resources are allocated, either by markets or by government?
Okay,
Is that
so,
not true?
yeah, so it's either by price, which is what you mean markets,
Yes.
or it's by something else.
Yes. Well, isn't
So-
that
so
other
let's
than
say-
government?
by diktat or by price, right?
Yeah, so for example, we can tax gasoline so people use less. Or we can have a law that says cars have to get, everything has to get 50 miles a gallon. So that even if you have money, you still got, anybody can drive around. So they're regressive and progressive. Or we can say you can't use it at all. Okay, and you have to, so you can legislate uses or you can allocate by price. Some things make sense to allocate by price. Other things, to me, make less sense and are, kind of unfair.
Just say, so I've now joined the Communist Party because I was expelled from the Labour Party. So I want to write stuff, for their Communist Review, and so I'm to try to convince them that MMT, which I almost got debarred from
So-
joining the party.
so
I
what-
don't agree.
okay, so-
But is it not true then, that the communist believes in a command economy,
Yeah.
but that's how you can command the economy?
Yeah, but command economies have underperformed
Yes.
regular economies, market economies, in that they lose the war. And if you lose the war, it's too bad, it's too late. You're gone. So, on a practical level with human beings who fight each other, you want an economy that's going to win the war for you. But yeah, so you have elements that are command economy and elements that are left
Yes.
market, and that's how they all are. They're all
Well,
mixed.
markets are good.
But what you can say for the Communist Party that Marx never understood, that MMT has introduced, and maybe, is that unemployment is created by taxation by design. They don't have that in there.
No.
They've got capitalists or somebody creating it, or markets creating it. It's not a market thing. It's done by a monopolist restricting supply. The currency monopolist is not spending enough to cover the need to pay taxes, the desire to save. It's the money store. And they need that to understand
I
unemployment.
know,
Yeah.
they
Okay.
need to learn.
But in Marx's defense, Warren, in Marx's defense, under Marx's time, there was no floating currency though. It was gold backed.
Yeah, but there was tax.
Yeah, but there was tax, but you had to have a tax to keep the. I mean, you couldn't spend like you can spend now because it wasn't fiat currency.
Well, there were, at least
It
Alfred
was
the
backed by
Great.
gold or by commodity.
No,
right?
well, only for a few years, but before that it was all fiat. Alfred the Great was all fiat. But yeah, I mean, he might have had a restriction there, but still, the unemployment's coming from the same place,
Right.
It's from the taxation. It's just the government couldn't spend to hire the people that it cost to be unemployed. But it didn't have to lock its currency to gold either.
Right.
So that was a policy choice to have gold and unemployment. Okay, so they were doing that because it was mercantilist and it was an export-led growth narrative. Yeah.
There's a chap here, I think.
Yeah.
So Warren, we can't have a session on inflation without talking about asset prices.
Yeah.
So how have we got to the point where people cannot afford to buy a house and in fact we can't afford to build them? Is it bad bank lending policy, and how do we extricate ourselves from this housing problem that we have everywhere?
So, people are renting them, so they can't afford to own rather than rent. And if it serves public purpose to own rather than rent, then you can go ahead and do something. So we decided in the U.S. 50, 75 years ago that families would be better, children would be better off if the parents were owners rather than renters. Right or wrong, I don't know. So we set up this Fannie Mae, Freddie Mae, these government housing agencies, and gave mortgages at lower rates from the federal government than the banks would have done, based on, bank capital requirements, which were set by the government. That's why the rates were different. So it's still institutional structure. So instead of changing the capital requirements so banks could lend at lower rates, they had the housing agencies do it. And for 30 or 50 years, we had millions and millions of people move into their own houses, raise their children, and I don't know if it was better or not, but presumably it was better. Then in 08, we have an issue where the economy crashes and the markets panic and the stocks of these companies go down and the value of their bonds goes down on a mark-to-market basis. And the opposition says, look, this program's been a complete failure. These people are going to lose money. It's like, this has been 50, 70 years of putting people in houses, because it was public policy to do that and benefits to do that. And of course, 2 years later, after they heavily, modified it or whatever, attacked them, they were making profits and paying back the liquidity loans that the government made, which weren't real loans, they were just backup in case they needed it. And they were profitable again. So, yes, it can all be done with housing agencies if you'd rather have people own rather than rent. It can be done with public programs, fixed rate programs, and the real benefits, if there are any, having ownership over renting are there, and they will be, gained by the society if you do that. The criticisms will be things like, after 50 years of success, it has a mark-to-market loss for a half hour. See, we never should have done this. So, and it's just political. It swings back and forth. So the short answer is yes, you can do that. It's not hard to do. There are plenty of models where it's been done to do it, and it's just a political will to do it. It's nothing more than that.
Don? Awesome. Do you remember your own question on the Steve Keen? You mentioned
this was a deflationary currency, the Virgils.
The Virgil, yeah.
Well, Steve Keen has a story about Virgil in Austria in the Depression where they have a deflating currency.
Yeah.
And so they went from 30% unemployment to zero unemployment. So we're talking about inflation, which is kind of like a deflationary currency. So, do you have comments about deflationary currencies?
People do that. I don't know. I'm not sure what the public purpose is. Japan's had a 2% unemployment for a long time and no inflation and a 0% rate in a regular, normal currency, if you want to call it. It's not a deflating currency. In terms of self-destructing, I think that's just annoying.
Well,
just an annoyance, don't you think? That's
the other part of the question.
Your money expires or something.
So the other part of the question, now that I remember it, was we have huge inequality. So don't we want to? So why are we avoiding inflation? Wouldn't inflation actually help us reduce the inequality we have in our economy? We want to reduce some of the wealth inequality.
Why is everybody in favor of the lottery? That creates more inequality. I asked Bernie Sanders through his people, what's his position on the lottery? They wouldn't answer. They want equality, but the lottery's a good thing. Okay. I guess they just don't want inequality that's earned, where there's favoritism, where it's inherited or somebody's started a company that does bad things and made a lot of money or something, as opposed to a guy who bought a lottery ticket, because anybody could have done that, so it's fair. I don't know how they think about it. They don't seem to be against inequality per se. It seems to be something about the means that I can't quite keep track of. Now, I don't, the biggest thing we can do is go back to a zero rate policy. This interest paying is just exacerbating it. And it's a pretty easy thing to do. And it gets rid of the inflation and it gets rid of the inequality it's creating, and nobody will even consider it. So I think you're answering a question not enough people are asking.
Yeah, there's only that.
Yeah, the zero interest rate policy, we've had super low interest rates for the last 15 years. And over that period, we've had a massive increase in wealth inequality. arguably, because super cheap credit pumped up asset prices,
Yeah.
which redistributes wealth upwards from young to old, old to rich.
Yeah.
So isn't there a risk that if you advocate zero interest rate policy, you aggravate that effect?
I suppose there is. It didn't happen in Japan. They've had it for longer than anybody, so I'm not sure it's a zero rate policy. In the U.S., it started to go the other way a little bit the last 4 or 5 years of the zero rate policy because of the interest thing. So I think you have to look for other parts of the institutional structure that are causing that. And the zero rates will cause a one-time adjustment in asset prices because then they reflect the risk-adjusted returns that they're making. And yeah, if you discount them at a different rate, you get it. But I look at asset prices under a zero rate policy as the base case for asset prices. That's kind of where they start out. Like Pompeii had a zero rate policy, they didn't have asset prices running away. And then if you raise rates, now you're starting to tinker with them. And then when you drop them again, you're causing all these distortions. So, we had
So one of the distortions is a lot of the finance market relies on gilts at the foundational level for a lot of collateral and leverage. And what has happened there is in this country, the private pension industry has suffered. And if you want a really low risk pension fund for drawdown, you rely on government bonds. And if they're sitting at almost zero, you're forcing your investment company to put more into stocks and shares, and then your risk level, you can't get a 0 to level 1 risk now, they're all at level 3 or 4 risk if you want a low risk.
But in theory that should affect the price. I know it does short term, but I can go through that with you. And there are other things you can do about this stuff. Now if you look at just the stock market, that's different. There are other things you can do there, and there are other things that cause that effect, and that doesn't need to be there either. That's just all institutional structure. But you looking at anything other than the stock market? Because when I looked at they said it forces people into lower quality bonds or something. But if you look at the number of lower quality bonds, the total didn't change. So if somebody was forced into it, whoever had the lower quality bond was sold it and bought higher quality. They were always in difference levels. It changed the spreads between the two that narrowed them, but it didn't cause any excess issuance. I didn't see any excess of debt growth in the UK during that time. I didn't see excess credit growth or excess mortgage growth. I just didn't see any of that. So you had adjustments in asset prices. If you look now, the PE ratios on US stocks are about the same as they were when we had lower rates. And the rates are much higher. Now that's supposed to cause them to go down. It didn't happen because the income effects on the other side are adding to growth prospects. So there's a lot of things in here, and the stock market creation doesn't need to be there that way. I've proposed that all new issues come at $10 a share. For this example, I got 1 million proposals. And the company will also issue unlimited shares at 20. Therefore, the stock can never go over 20. You're investing for the returns on equity. As you buy more from the company at 20, if you want to, as it's making more money, you're getting a share of their earnings and you're getting your fair return on investment. But you don't have a price that's subject to speculation and options and everything else. And so you've closed that room in the casino, so to speak. But you've still kept your investment channel open. So there are things that in the system we have that foster this type of stuff that you're talking about. And I think that the interest rate's been given too much credit or detriment for what's happened by a wide margin.
But under the ZERP policy, right? Under
Yeah.
ZERP, we did see across the world, massive asset price inflation.
Not in Japan.
But Japan had a yield curve maintenance going on, right? They were actively.
Well, I mean, you come up with a lot of reasons. That should make it even more asset price inflation.
But Japan is a
As an exception.
That's in the Anglo-American world, right? Anglo-American neoliberal world. You saw massive asset price inflation, regardless.
So we should have started talking Japanese, and we wouldn't have had it.
But Japan has two things going on. Japan they have massive fiscal transfers
Yeah.
to protect the people who need that protection.
Right.
And the central government, they go against the market and they maintain the yield curve. They do that.
Yeah, that's not going against the market, but I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, but I mean, most hedgies hate Japan because they can never bet against the GGBs, right?
But even if they did, it would only be a few basis points.
Right. So my point is, Warren,
It only was
why did
worth
we
50
see that
basis
under the ZERP the massive asset price inflation. It was happening.
Yeah, but their stock market didn't go up. Go ahead.
So, given the fact that the Fed is
And their real estate didn't have that. And it's, the real assets didn't do that.
given the fact that the Fed is unlikely to listen to your advice to take rates to zero and they're going to keep even maybe pushing them up or keeping them stable for the next 2-3 years.
What's that?
Speak up.
Sorry, I was going to say, given that the Fed is not going to drop rates to zero and they're more likely to keep rates
Yeah.
at the current levels or even higher for the next couple of years, or at least that's what they say. What is going to happen to the political situation when these budget deficits start to, say, become like double digit? I think it's 8, 9, let's say it goes to 10, 11, 12. How does this, what's the end game here? What happens? How do we rectify this? What's going to happen?
Oh, you tell me. I don't know what these guys are going to. They're going to keep raising rates to make it worse. That
So
was
is it
just cause.
Argentina, Turkey, or is that
Yeah, Argentina. Yeah, I mean, central bank just sees the rates go up for any reason. They raise inflation rate go up. They raise the interest rates. They just got it backwards on it. That's my concern. Is on where does it end? Because they all say, well, if they raise them enough, there'll be a crash and then it'll end. But it doesn't cause a crash. It causes it to keep going. If there was going to be a crash in Argentina, it would have happened before 118%. Turkey had like 15 years of 100% interest rates. They had like, I don't know, 8% or 4% real growth the whole time.
could this happen in the US?
No, in Turkey in the 80s, yeah.
No, but could it happen in the US?
It's the same spreadsheet. There's no reason why it can't. I mean, they have other policies going on. They have, all kinds of index securities that add to it. But the U.S. has a lot of index TIPS bonds. Now it's up to, I don't know, 150 billion or something. It's up there. And the U.K. has a lot of index bonds.
Yeah.
And so as they raise rates, the deficit goes up on those index bonds. I don't even know if they count that as part of the deficit.
Can you just say what the
There's a
TIPS
chap
bonds
with a
are?
beard here. Sorry, carry on, Chris.
I was just going to say, can you just say what the TIPS bonds are?
Oh yeah, the inflation index U.S. Treasury bonds. They're paying 2% over the inflation rate. So if inflation rate goes to 10, they go to 12. There's no policy decision to go to 12. It just happens. So that they pay out 12, it causes rates, inflation to go to 14. So then they go to 16. So they're not large enough to do that now, but they're getting there because it keeps growing exponentially. When it first came out, 10, 15 years ago, I read a whole thing about this. It's nuts. This is like external debt. And it just,
Seen about 3 hands go up. I think it's this chap with the beard here.
So all the speech and everything, matrix, etc., etc. I want to be sure that I understand your idea when you say that taxation causes unemployment. Okay. Do you mean that if somehow we abolish all forms of taxations, then suddenly everyone finds a job that satisfies their own, standards, or
so if
means
there's
that
no
the definition?
if there's no taxation, then there's no tax credit. There's no money because the dollar is just a tax credit. So the tax credit's not worth anything without a tax, right? So if you have a non-monetary society, you never have unemployment. You don't have people looking for paid work. You have families. You have a sheep station in Australia, non-monetary. Everybody's working, doing something. You have a monastery. You have Africa before the Europeans went in. There was no people looking around for paid work, which is idle. 10% of their population or something. You might have a couple of kids who are hiding, but you don't get unemployment. So you don't even begin to get anything like people looking for paid work until there's something to pay them with. And that happens as a consequence of taxation. So it's kind of a tautology definition. But it's revealing as to who's responsible for what's going on. It's not the market created unemployment, or it's not because you didn't go to college or something like that. It's because the tax caused you to become unemployed. College graduate might have took your job that you could have done, but he's more qualified, so he got it. Okay, that's different.
There's a chap in the blue T-shirt there.
Okay, so continuing on from what's going to happen with interest rates and inflation. In the 70s, we had high inflation and high interest rates. Yet something caused them both to come down. So just recently, it's only been very recently where inflation's going up again, but we had the government's trying to get the inflation rate up again because the interest rates were at 0.5%. Something happened in the meantime to bring this all down. What happened? Can that happen again?
What happened when, in the 70s?
Between the 70s and now, where we had high inflation, high interest,
Okay, so
and it all came down.
in the 70s we had the oil prices. It's always been oil. They went from $3, $2.50 to $3. Now, why was oil at $2.50 to $3? Because the Texas Railroad Commission had quotas for the U.S. oil companies who had excess capacity. They could produce more than the world needed, more than the U.S. needed. And so the price would have gone down to nothing. And so to support prices, the Texas Railroad Commission put quotas on the American oil companies to keep the price around $2.50 or something like that. Well, as demand picked up, okay, the price isn't going to go down anymore. Now there was more demand than they had, and the quotas got smaller and smaller. By 1970, 71, the quotas were gone because global demand was high. And so prices were then in a position where you had the Texas Oil Commission trying to keep prices, support prices. Now that price support is moot, right? Because now instead of excess capacity, there's a shortage of capacity. Now the excess capacity switches to Saudi Arabia. Okay, so now Saudi Arabia becomes the swing producer. They're the ones who set price and let quantity adjust. So they set the quota on themselves, so to speak. So they set a $3 price, and they'd sell maybe 3/4 or 70 or 80% of their output. American companies were now producing their full output, so they no longer needed to have quotas to support prices because price demand is up. Well, the Saudis had different idea than the Texas Railroad Commission about where prices ought to be. Texas Railroad Commission held prices steady for, 14 years or something, which are the golden years of economics. You read about the golden years, nobody talks about the Texas Railroad Commission keeping oil prices constant with their quotas. High, above market value, but flat, so there's no inflation and people could plan and everything else. The Saudis decide, okay, our job is to get as much money as possible, not to stabilize the U.S. economy. And the price went from like 3 to 11 in a couple of years. It tripled or something like that. And so we had a big burst of prices going up because the cost of everything went up because power companies, utilities were all using oil back then. Okay, and then by 1980, 79, they got up to $40. So the price went up from 3 to 40. What's that, 12 or 13 times? That's like today going from 80 to 1,000. Okay, and that caused, through the cost side, and everything to adjust up. Globally, everybody's went up. And the Fed under Volcker decided to fight this by raising interest rates. Now, what interest rates did initially was add more money and keep prices up. But what happened was, and this is important if you're analyzing things today. In 1979, the inflation rate was like 12%, but the budget deficit was 6%. So what happened to the public debt? Public debt went up by 6% because the budget deficit was 6%. But the real value was down by 12% because of inflation. Inflation pushed it down 12. So the real value of our savings went down 6%. This is like running a budget surplus in a zero inflation market. Okay, our real savings dropped. So companies inflation is creating the money shortage I talked about, where companies need more money, and the amount of net financial assets out there is dropping because of inflation. It's not being replenished by deficit spending. It caused a horrible collapse. 1979, and it rippled for a couple of years. We had a double dip recession and everything. Now they gave Volcker credit for having caused the recession, but it was the budget going into, in real terms, surplus that caused this huge drop. Okay, the way I looked at it, I was in actively in markets back then. I started in 1973, and so it was another time I think the mainstream got it completely wrong. And he kept the rates high, and so the inflation lingered. Now the other thing that happened is, once the price got up to 40, and the economy crashed because of the budget surplus, the demand dropped. And so now the Saudis had to cut prices to keep, OPEC cut they all got together. They cut production like 15 million barrels a day. It was huge, and it wasn't enough. And the price came down to like 10 or 15 and stayed there for a long time until demand picked back up again. And so that was that cycle. So we haven't had anything that severe. And the other thing is, Jimmy Carter did something. He deregulated natural gas in 1978. Now, it didn't change the supply a lot right away, but it changed like companies, public utilities, to go from oil to natural gas because now it would be available. Before, because of the regulated price was too low, nobody drilled for it. It was capped. All the wells were capped. Well, then they started producing it again, and contracts started being signed, and it started replacing oil. And we got into all kinds of substitutes, coal and natural gas and things like that happened to them. And we successfully heated the Earth up by 10 degrees to fight the next glacier that's coming.
One thing you get from Warren, this probably happened to you just over the last 5 minutes, you start to reassess your whole, like, how you viewed the 70s inflation. I don't know. You're thinking, well, I didn't realise that. And so that's the danger. But remember, I warned you. Okay? I just wondered if Vincent Gomez is here. Can you remember your own question? Because it might be nicer if you can.
Yeah, my question was, when I talk to people about NFT money creation, I distance around the facts of how government spending works in a free economy, and normally the pushback I get is that it's a theory. Have you ever done any work, or do you have any kind of guide to how we can separate the facts for how money is created from some of the more theoretical work, maybe some of the NFT theoretical work?
I don't know that there is any theoretical. Which theory?
No, well, I don't know.
It's called modern monetary theory because somebody on Bill Mitchell's blog started saying that 10 years ago. None of us liked it, but they all started calling it.
Well, I guess things that people may take exception, although now I think now I have a better understanding with the job guarantee.
Yeah.
So my theory is for a job guarantee. My theory is for basic income.
Yeah. Just call it your proposal.
Yes, but when we're talking about money creation, there is no theory. Money is created. Government spends.
Well, first you have to define money.
Yes.
Okay, so how are you defining it as dollars in accounts at the Federal Reserve Bank, dollars in the accounts of a commercial bank, pieces of paper in your pocket? Somebody asks you like which stuff are you talking about?
Yeah,
So,
normally it's spending tokens in the private sector.
yeah, well, they all come from the government. Treasury Secretary signs them, so you know who creates those. A $20 bill, it says right on it who created it,
Yeah,
unless it's counterfeit.
Even progressives I speak to,
The money in the bank was created by the bank. The bank changed the number up in your bank account. It's scorekeeping. It's like points on a scoreboard, right?
Do you know Neil's book?
Not sure.
Yeah, that is extremely comprehensive. It's got it all.
First chapter of the GIMMS book, which is available for free online on the Alcohol website, was Neil and Andrew and and Richard. Yes, they've got the whole thing explained. There's also the original
document,
very large. How many pages?
200 odd.
200. Yeah, that's on the GIMMS website as well, but that it take a while. But the first chapter of the book is available for free on Alcohol Online, which has got all of the basic facts of what happened.
I'll give you the 30-second version.
Yeah.
If you borrow money from a bank, you sign a note. They buy that from you. It's their asset. They pay for it by putting a balance in your account. And that's money creation. That's the whole thing. Okay, now, if you use that to spend it, it goes to somebody else's account. But it doesn't change. All it can do is move back and forth between accounts unless it's used to pay off the loan or buy it from the bank. And there's nothing else to it. Same thing.
It's just difficult because whenever I speak about this, they say, "Oh, you're talking about a monetary theory. It's just a theory." And when you try to
theory of gravity.
Yes.
Yeah.
To get it across, there may be some things that are theoretical, but there are some things that are just facts.
Well, you can just say
trick-
there isn't
the trick
anything.
with that one is to say, so you think evolution is still a theory?
No, but it's none of it's theoretical that I know of.
I think you guys called it wrong by calling it theory, I think. Right?
I didn't call it theory.
Was it Bill Mitchell?
Yeah. I've probably got time for one short question. Got to be short though. Okay,
So-
go for it.
In your ideal world, what would central bankers do?
It's a short question, but
It's not great.
it's a long answer.
They would regulate the banking system, which they already do, but let me concentrate on that. There's room for improvement.
They shouldn't really be any more important than the head of any government department, like the head of the Department for Transport, Department of Work and Pensions. It's all they are, but they're elevated to this position because it's got the word bank in it.
Arguably, this should be just as anonymous as well.
Yeah,
They get paid a lot more to speak after they retire too.
they get paid.
After they retire to speak at corporate engagements.
Yeah.
Draghi gets
Yeah, well, Lord King's not
250,000
too
to
fond
speak.
of us, but he's got the, I used to be the bank. Everybody seems to forget that he completely screwed it up in 2008. I don't know why anybody even speaks to him. Lord King, Mervyn King.
Lord King.
Not the dark there.
He probably knows more about monetary policy.
Right, I think we've kind of run out of time, so let's give Warren a round of applause.
Wow, what can I say? It's been a real pleasure to have Warren with us. Thank you so much, Warren, for coming. We're very grateful that he was able to stop over in London on his way to Berlin for the MMT conference. Very sorry that GIMMS aren't going this year, but there we are. I'm sure that you'll all agree that it's been really informative and engaging. Food for thought, as Phil said, to take away with us for later. Thank you too to the audience for actually coming despite all the obstacles that have been thrown under our feet. I hope you'll agree that it was worth the extra hassle for some of you to get here, and also for Warren's presentation and an opportunity to get together after some very difficult times. It's really nice to see some of the old faces in this room again, so thank you very much. Now, we need more than ever, and I keep saying this, I know, but I'm going to say it again, to work together and build greater public awareness through the written word, through video, through audio podcasts. We've got to suit everybody's learning needs, that's absolutely key. And in simple terms, we've got to educate for the future. Now, we really hope you've enjoyed the day, and if you want to keep in touch with GIMMS, we can be found on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. And we also do the occasional newsletter, so you can sign up on our website for that. Finally, we are a very small organisation and we depend on donations to fund our work. So if you can spare us some cash, you can find the donate button again on our website. All that remains for me now to say is thank you so much for coming, and I wish you all a safe, or the GIMMS team wishes you all a safe, trouble-free journey home. Thank you very much.
Thank you.